All right, so we're going to begin our next section. The major section here, if you've been looking at the itinerary, is the production section. We've got Seth. He's going to be talking about the asset collection, project management, troubleshooting, kind of going through some workflow issues. So I'll hand it over to you, Seth.
Thank you. As Jeff said, my name is Seth Borney. I'm an art director here at Neoscape. I do a few different things. One of certainly, the biggest thing is producing, managing a team, producing the images for our stills, our movies. I also work a lot with our interactive and our web department as far as figuring out 3D solutions for both of those formats, which you'll actually be able to see a little bit of the interactive things that I've done here today, because it's one of the more complicated things that I've had to do in the past year. So that's a brief basis of what I do, but let's get in here into our production. I'm going to cover 4 main points today, and I'm going to try to get through it as quickly as possible, because it is there's a lot of information and a lot of different techniques. But the 4 points I want to hit today is, the first is processing assets. We do modeling in-house, but we also receive a great deal of information from architects, from different clients like real estate developers or someone. So we get a lot of things in a lot of different ways, and we've had to develop strategies over the years to be able to process that into the way we work, which we are a 3ds Max and V-Ray studio, so that's primarily how we work. And then getting in things into Max, we generally do everything layers by material, and then we follow sort of a naming convention so we can work with those assets cleanly and easily. So I'm going to walk through some export standards for 2 main programs that we use. We receive. One is Rhino and one is SketchUp, and do a little bit of the advantages and disadvantages of using those. I'm going to show how we bring those in and how we filter out a lot of information, bring in a lot of our good information, some different strategies for using scripts and some plugins to deal with that. Then I'm going to go through our typical scene organization, show you how that's set up, ways that we work with that file and doing different things based on some in-house scripts that we have. And then the last thing is a very complicated scene. So this is one of those things that this was a real challenge for me. So I'm going to share with you some strategies that we used to build that scene, and then be able to use and render it out for a particular product. So starting out, I have a client model up here on the screen. This is in Rhino. As you can see, it is a little difficult. So let me back out here. As you can see, it's a fairly complicated high geometry scene. If we go into our layer stack, it's a high-rise tower, right? So there's a site component, a base component, and then a tower component. If we go into our layer stack in Rhino, you can see that it's kind of a mess, right? Tons of layers, lots of different objects. There is some material callouts, but it's all over the place, and we need to figure out a way to glean that down. So one of our first steps is always to go into our block manager here, and you'll see that once you come up in the block manager, you're going to see all these little link status things, which Rhino works similar to CAD or Max in that these block managers are sort of extracting into the scene. They're components that people can add in, and it's an efficient workflow for the client, not necessarily us for 3ds Max. So we need to get this in how we need it to work. So one of the things you need to do is go in here with all these blocks, go into properties, you need to embed them. And once you do that, you'll see this thing switched over to not linked. I'm not going to go through this whole scene because it took me about 2 hours, I think, to do this initially. But what we're going to do is we want to go through, make that status all not linked, and then we want to come into our layer stack here, and we really need to simplify this in order to get it out into Max in a way that's helpful. So I'm actually going to open up our finish scene, which is for export here. And this particular thing, I think the prep you can do in a program or the prep you do in the Max is really, it's one of the most overlooked things, but also one of the things you need to do or need to be the most on top of, because it can really help you down the line when you come to dealing with changes. or being able to learn and understand what your model actually is. So taking the time to actually do a good export can sort of educate you to what your project is, what it looks like, and you know how it's. Let's click off here. How it's structured. All set? OK. Apologize for that little interruption there. We have the new file up. And as you can see from our previous file, much cleaner, much simpler. And we're actually able now to go through the different components of our project. We're able to turn off the different layers of the building. And we're also able to turn off the tower and things. So we can start to really work through and organize our scene. So for Rhino, there's really two different ways that you can export. And it really depends on the kind of it's a little bit of experience, but it's also kind of getting what you get from the client and making a judgment call. This client gave us a really rectilinear model. When you get models like this, you can actually export the entire thing out as what we usually start with is exporting the entire thing out as an AutoCAD. Well, there we go. One of those, this never really happens. Programs always work for us. They never crash. So this is a unique experience. But so every now and then you'll have a little technical glitch. But so if the model is fairly rectilinear, you can go in and export it as a DWG file in the 2004 Solids protocol. So I'll show you that here real quick. And while we're waiting for that to open. Do one here. You'll be able to export out in the 2004 AutoCAD Solids protocol, which gives you a nice little model that's fairly easy to work with. There are some things about it that aren't the best, so we'll cover that on the import into Max, but it's a fairly simple export. Just select your objects, go to Export Selected, and then what you want to select is AutoCAD Drawing, and then under Options here, you'll just select 2004 Solids, and then I just keep all the default settings here. So that'll export out into a little DWG file. And then what you do in Max is you'll just want to import. You're going to get the standard dialog box you get in Max when you bring in CAD files. So if we were to open this, and again in Max, I just generally follow what's up and what's standard, right? So you'll bring in, I believe it's layers by material with the node hierarchy, and that should be able to get you the basic model that you want to bring into Max. I've actually already brought it in because it does take a few minutes, but I'll just show you the dialog box here that we use in Max. So I use the layer blocks by node as node hierarchy and split by material, and then keep all the other things standard. And so that'll bring in the model that we have in the background. But there's one thing about this particular model that I don't like, and that's if you go to the layer manager, you'll see essentially what happens when you export in this standard is that it's going to give you a structure, the layer structure of Rhino separated by $signs, right? Which is something that somebody has to go in, manually clean up, and that you hope everything is on its current layer, or its correct layer, which takes a lot of time. And at the end of the day, you have to trust that everything from Rhino came out correctly, which when you're dealing with Rhino files that have the exceptionally curved surfaces where there's a lot of different forms or shapes, it can actually not process out. And that's why we typically only use this for rectilinear models. So there's a second method that we use most often here, which I would recommend more, which is the way that allows you, it's a way that allows you to become more familiar with your file, because what you do is you actually export out each object in its own file. So that way you know what you're exporting and what you're importing, and then you can control that and make sure you're getting the information in and out how you want. So that, I'll show it here just for a particular part, because it can take a while as well. Any layer in Rhino, if you right-click, you will then, you can right-click and select, say, select objects. Select your objects, and what you want to do is you want to export that selection as a ACIS, SAT file. And then let's go to our desktop. Rhino and SATs. So you'll see here that I've actually renamed a little bit from the layer structure in Rhino, and we'll get to this in a second, but you just come out and save, and then we'll replace that, and I just use default always. So we'll do default. Again, select objects, and we'll just export these three here quickly. So your granite, and select objects, and export limestone. Replace that. So now we have those three objects exported out. So let's get in a new, thank you. Let's get in a new version of Max my scene, and now we're just going to import those SAT files. So when you do SATs, you can actually do multiple ones, but you can't do multiple ones from the initial dialog. So we're going to select one, we're going to open that. For this particular one, I'm just going to do the settings of a very fine mesh body and then a tight trimming tolerance. And then this box here, you can actually select multiple. So if you went through your entire scene and exported out sort of piece by piece, like for our part, it was the lower piece and then the tower, you could layer those out in different SAT files and then bring them in individually or in sets based on what you wanted to actually check and look at. For the site, I'm just going to bring in the other two. You never want to select your first one, because then it'll bring that one in twice. So you want to be mindful of that. We're going to open that and then just import those. And so now what we should see is those objects that we exported from Rhino. But the great thing about this is if you actually look at your layer stack now, you're starting, the names of your SAT files turn into the layers in 3D Studio Max. So it's a way to control on the export what you get on the import, and then that way you can start and just hit the ground running coming out into 3D Studio Max. So that's, and then this way too, as you're working through that Rhino file, like I was saying about particular things, some layers have mesh bodies and some layers have curved items. So you can actually select and export out different things in different ways. And this way you can make sure that you're actually getting the entire model from Revit into Max and that those meshes are working properly. Or you could try different experiments at different things like 3DS or an AutoCAD or DWG file for pieces of geometry that are causing problems in a different format. So that's why walking through layer by layer is a little bit more useful than just doing a direct export. So we're going to exit out of Rhino now, and we're going to talk really quick about another program which I find is probably one of the more challenging programs to bring information into Max effectively, which is SketchUp. Just because between the two programs, they definitely handle information differently. And they're both great programs in their own right, but certainly getting one into the other can be a little bit problematic, especially if you work how we do with layers by materials. I know there's a direct import now for 3ds Max, but it's not one that I typically use very often. So I wanted to show here, this is a project that we worked on recently. And so this is the sort of file we get from a client. And while all this information is useful, our project is actually only this little piece here. So we want to figure out ways that we can take this model, clean it up, get it into Max, so we can start working on it as fast as possible. Well, it was actually the initial point. It was the whole tower, but yes, in further iterations, it was just the lobby. I think we have some Elkis people in the crowd apparently. So how do we do this? One of the things I do is, first thing I do is I'll clean up all the context buildings, right? And then looking at the other pieces or the other assets, what I want to do is start identifying things that I can get rid of that are going to make importing in Max a problem. Specifically things I know that we're going to replace. So one of the first things are things like trees. You can come into these components. Things with a lot of polygons from SketchUp take a lot of time when they come into Max. So the first thing I do is I start to drill down into each of these sorts of things and delete out the stuff I don't need. I'll show you guys a little bit later how we use object replacer script to actually bring in things from our library, which are good models that we like to use in place of things like this, which, like for our models or for our scenes, we typically don't use a SketchUp tree because it doesn't necessarily look as good as a 3D tree that we have. So what we'll do is we'll get rid of the leaves but keep the trunk so we can use that placement as a thing to snap a new tree to with scripting. So I'd look at things like that and start deleting, all of those kind of things out. Or I would come in and, again, different files are set up differently, but I start to go in and delete out all the people, right? And get rid of all the things that I don't think we'll need. I'll clean out all the chairs, but keep a table because I'll replace the tables and chairs with a better model that we have. So learning little things like that or cleaning out little things like that can speed up your both exporting from SketchUp and also importing into Max. I know before we started to establish standards like this and we were just doing direct imports, it could take a day to export from SketchUp and a day to import, which is really slows down a production pipeline, especially if you're on a really tight schedule of 3 or 4 days to turn around a bunch of renderings. So we wanted to figure out a way to get it in and out as fast as possible. So we'll give it a second here to open, and while that's opening, I'll just show you. This is the in the next one you'll see the clean file, but this is actually what after the export standard that I show you, what's going to come into Max, which is essentially we export it from SketchUp by material, and then we bring it into Max, and I'll show you a really quick way that we can actually sort all the objects in the scene by material, and then we can start to break down each of those materials into the respective layers and be able to replace things. So let's come back here. I guess we're going to need to wait a little bit longer for this to come up. So this is our cleaned up file. So again, you can see we got rid of the context buildings. We've gotten rid of the majority of the trees and the set dressing. We've cleaned out, a lot of the things that we don't need anymore. So in this particular case, what I would do is, let's get this where we can see it. I do, again, another selection. I typically use selections because if the model you're getting from the client has, say that this, this tower is its own object. So we could export the tower as a separate file, export the site as a separate file, export the content, like the surrounding buildings as a separate file, have different people work on it, and then put a whole model together. And by doing it by selection, if the tower were to change, we could just export the tower, right? So using selections can help you replace certain things in the files. So I'll go to export 3D model, and then under options, I use 3ds. I export by material. Again, only the current selection. I export two-sided faces as geometry. I uncheck this. Essentially what the standalone edges does is it gives you a little piece of geometry that mimics that hand sketchy feeling that SketchUp gives, which normally you don't want in your 3ds Max scenes. I export my texture maps in. We always, here at Neoscape, use inches. Again, depending on your country of origin, that'll probably change between inches and centimeters, but we use inches, so that's an important thing to check here. So again, I won't export that out because it'll take it does still take a little bit, but once you import that into Max here, you'll see that right now our entire scene is on layer 0, which doesn't really help us that much. But we've developed a script in-house, aptly named the SketchUp Import Awesomizer, that will allow us to do different tasks that we do repetitively for SketchUp files like this. So again, I'm going to show it on a smaller segment of this particular scene, which will just show these patio tables here. And we're just going to put these on a new layer real quick, and we'll turn off the rest, and we'll add that back. So a couple of things that we use. If we first look at the selection, we see that these are all standard materials, which I'll show. We use a converter to convert all of those things as well. But one of the first things we want to do here is we have a function that will take all the objects and actually add it to layers based on materials. And then with these, we can start turning things off and organizing our scenes. Another thing that we use quite often is, as I mentioned really quickly, is the material converter. So this will allow you to take, I'm going to do selected objects and just convert a standard material into a V-Ray material, which is our render engine. So you'll be able to convert an entire scene at a particular point from standard or mental ray, whatever native materials, and put it all into V-Ray. And then a couple of the other things that we use is for particular objects like set dressing, you could go through and replace an entire scene of set dressing by hand or using the align tool, which works, but it takes a little while. One of the things we use, again, it's this one is free. Neil Blevins, who first started writing blur scripts, also came out with Soulburn scripts. One of them is called Object Replacer. These are all, again, free online. What Object Replacer allows you to do is it allows you to replace both objects and groups with other pieces of geometry. So if I come into, if I just merge into my scene a group here, which is a standard table. It's a standard table and chairs from our library. It's already a group. So you can see in the Max dialog, it's a group. It's V-Ray proxies, so being able to swap that stuff out for lightweight geometry like this is helpful in managing your scene and being able to render without causing too many problems. What I'll do is, first off, Object Replacer works on the pivot point. Every object created in Max has 27 different pivot points based on where the based on the orientation of the object. So the bottom has 9, the middle has 9, the top has 9, right? To replace this, we know that we want to replace the bottom center, so that's why I use bottom center here. And then you just need to make sure that your replacement object has the same sort of bottom center orientation. Then we can take this, select our objects, the object we want to replace with. If you select just the object itself, you'll replace it with just the table. But if you actually select, if you open the group really quickly and you select the group, let's close that back down. You can actually replace all these objects if you use this option here, treat selected groups as one object, with a group. And right now, the only thing I'm really concerned about is position, rotation, and scale. So I'm going to replace all of these objects with my group at the position, rotation, and scale. And I'm actually not going to delete originals here, so you can actually see what happens. So we'll apply that. So let's say the scene has 500 tables and chairs. You could easily use the bottom of the tables to replace all of those and amend it with something from your library. It's high poly, it looks good, and it has the right materials, right? So you can see that these are now sitting on that particular piece, right? So that's a very, very handy tool. So we use these for set dressing, for trees, for say we need to swap out. Sometimes we'll do 3D people and the particular ethnicity or something isn't right. We can swap those people out with different things from our libraries that that'll fulfill those requirements. So that's really it for importing SketchUp. Again, overall, we'd end up doing a lot more than we should. We'd end up processing the whole scene, layering things out, putting it into our standard sort of nomenclature. So the next part is, what does that nomenclature look like here? And let's reset, and let's open a good scene. Oh, sorry, question?
Is there an automatic way to replace the materials that you imported from SketchUp with the materials that you have in your library?
There may be a way to script that. I think the thing, though, that you lose is that I know I would like to go in and make sure that you're assuming that the SketchUp model that you're receiving has everything done perfectly. And when you pipe it in, there's a direct correlation between those things.
Yeah.
Which can happen, but it's a little more difficult. And doing it the way we were showing allows you to actually select each one and make sure that you have those things the way you really want them. But it could be done, but I think what you would lose is the ability to actually know that what you're getting in is how you want to keep working on the project.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
No problem.
Most of the 3 models that we're receiving from architects are coming from are done in either SketchUp or Revit. Have you had any issues exporting from Revit into 3D Max?
So Revit, I think I chose to show Rhino and SketchUp most because they're in my opinion, they're the more difficult ones to work with because Revit has some ties into Max. You tend to get a little bit of a cleaner import. The only problems we've ever really had with the Revit files are the sort of empty nodes and the block hierarchies that can come in from Revit into Max. And again, to go into a short, I think we have, so there's a Max scene cleaner on the web, and we've also developed some scripts internally that allow you to clean out different things, like those empty nodes, those empty hierarchies. Essentially, we developed a script that will take a dummy, assign it to that hierarchy, and then detach the hierarchy from the geometry, and then delete that empty node. So that'll clean out all those things. And that's the only real problem we've had with Revit, other than bringing it in. You want to bring it in a certain way where you can get rid of a lot of the Revit furniture, right? That's the other sort of strategy that we employ with the Revit files, because Revit files have a ton of information in them, and we want to get most of that out and get to what we want quickly. Does that answer your question?
Yes, Seth, there's also a question online here about whether or not you guys use SketchUp files all the time simply because they are quite heavy, as you obviously have pointed out.
So do we use SketchUp files all the time?
Yeah.
We typically will process a SketchUp file into Max. I think the usability of a SketchUp file is a little bit dependent on the artist's comfortable or how comfortable they are with SketchUp, how much time they want to spend in there, and then how much time they want to spend in the actual SketchUp file before they bring it into Max. So for us, it's we use it to get the information into Max, and we don't really stay in SketchUp that long.
Most architects tend to model glass as a single plane without any depth, and they're always glued to one another. Any different planes, they don't have any spaces between them.
Yeah.
What do you do about that?
So exporting, so say a SketchUp file, I think a lot of times the two-sided material thing is kind of that way in SketchUp, where you're going to get a single plane in the front and a single plane behind it, two different materials. So by exporting it the way I showed, you'd be able to separate out those two different materials and get rid of one, and then you'd be able to quickly collapse the different items. We use a script called Quick Collapse, which is, again, free online. You'll essentially get your objects, and then you'll be able to select them and collapse them down, and then assign a shell modifier, right, to give it the thickness. In V-Ray, there's also two ways to operate with that based on your materials. If you have a single plane with V-Ray, generally you can use a glass material, but with an IOR of 1. And with a shell, you need to put the actual IOR on it, which is the correct IOR. So depending on how you want to do it, you can sort of go with either option, if that makes sense.
Seth, can you quickly just go over what the advantages are of doing the export to 3ds version versus importing a SketchUp file directly?
Yeah, I think, again, that one probably comes with your fluidity between the two programs. For us, again, we like to get things into layers by materials because that's how we function. And in the next scene, I'll show you a little bit more on why we do that. I know the direct import preserves like component hierarchies and all those different things. So that can also be advantageous as well if that's the way that you're familiar with working. But again, just for us here, it's easier to get it out into those materials.
We definitely have to do that extra step to go to V-Ray.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're just doing quick mental ray exteriors, that's the gateway to do it. But I feel like maybe the 3ds way is by material is easier for V-Ray.
Yeah, I think the thing you lose is the direct SketchUp import is much faster. But I find myself spending much more time because you're essentially trying to learn how the person who modeled it, and convert that to how you want to work in Max. So again, if it's an inter-office thing where you can establish your own pipeline and standards, it would probably be a great way to figure out how to bring those in. But for us, every different client or every different architect we work with has a different way of working. So we need to figure out a way that we could just uniform it and sort of bring it in where we're at the end controlling the process and not trying to work backwards and figure out how someone else did it.
So the architects would have to model.
So for it to be easier for us, the renderers, the architects would actually have to model by material layers in SketchUp.
Yeah, and what I've found is that SketchUp tends to be driven more by the components and the component structures and less by layers by material, if that makes sense. Because in that sense, if you did layers by material in SketchUp, you could hide the layers you didn't want to see and then just export those particular things for particular things that you're working on, right? So generally the SketchUp files we get in have maybe a dozen layers for an entire project, so it makes figuring out where all those things are located much more difficult.
So there's another question online here about SketchUp import. It says, when I import SketchUp files, sometimes I get weird looking polygons. When I look in the orthographic view, it looks very good. Do you face same issues with, and what is the solution?
Okay, can you say that again, please? Sorry.
He's saying when you import SketchUp files, sometimes he gets weird looking polygons. And then he said it looks good in the orthographic view, but he wants to know how you deal with that and if there's a solution.
I guess I would ask, what does he mean by weird-looking polygons? Is it something where the polygon is subdivided, like it's got the triangulation to it, or double geometry? Like if you're in shaded mode and you're seeing the sort of, if you're panning around, you're seeing the black, like half black, half material in your shaded view. It might be that there's double geometry, which again, having your things layered out by material, you can sort of start to see where those things are doubling up.
No reply yet, so we'll move on to the next question and then we'll come back once he replies.
Hi. Do you have any tip of, when you are exporting like those curved surfaces from Rhino? Because, the architects love to send us these parabolic things that, whenever you need to export it, doesn't work.
Okay. I don't have a file with that specifically, but I can maybe run through really quick how we would approach that, if that helps. So when you do a file by, let's see here, so let's just open this up. When you're exporting your Rhino file and you have it layered properly, or layered in the way that we were showing, where it's sort of, you've controlled the layer stack, you can come in with the selection tools and actually select the different objects, like the mesh body or that particular curve object. And then with that selection, you can put that on another layer, and then you can experiment with different settings until it comes out right. Because what we found is for those curves, there kind of is no right rule. The right rule is the one that gets it into max correctly, if that makes sense. But so, if we just quickly here, let's turn off and I'll show in a limited way. So something like the curve here, or the curb here. Let's do the limestone. That's the bigger chunk. So if you select this, you're going to get this thing here in the Rhino dropdown, which is poly surfaces. So if you come into your selection tool, you have a bunch of different options for how you can actually select. So if I wanted to select just poly surfaces, by clicking this button, it's going to select all poly surfaces that are visible right now. So by controlling your layers and controlling what you're selecting, you'll be able to select specific things. So if you selected a layer like this granite, or the limestone again, sorry, and it had 2 poly surfaces, 2 meshes, 3 curves, you know that you have a bunch of different objects. And to me, that's a signal that you're probably going to need to export with a few different, that you may need to export with different standards. So if I had 3 different objects in a layer, I would take something like this limestone and say that instead of a poly surface, this was a curve. I'd make a new layer and I'd call it like paving curve, right? And I would add that selection. I would change that selection to that object layer. So now that object's just on this layer. So now I can select just this piece on this layer, and I can go and experiment with an SAT file, a DWG file, a 3DS file, and that way figure out which one works best for curves. I'll honestly say that I've exported curves, or those kind of curve data, in each of those formats, and depending on the mesh, it comes in differently. So there isn't a hard and fast rule. It's the one that when you bring it in, it looks right to you, and works the best for your pipeline. Does that help? Yeah. Are there any other questions? I think there's. Can I open it? Okay, keep on. Okay, so we pretty much talked about how we get things out. So what does something look like when it gets into our files? So give me a second here just to change my aspect ratio so we can see this. Again, another fairly recent project. So right now you're going to see what I would call our typical layer structure, our typical file structure. We follow that sort of CAD structure of CAD files. So we have from macro to micro and 4 to 6 characters, building exterior for everything on the outside, building interior for everything on the inside, site for everything in the site, and then things like set dressing, trees, tree pits, V-ray planes, stuff like that is all on different layers as well. One of the reasons we do this is we have some custom scripts, again, that we've developed in-house that allow us to quickly move through and work with different objects in different ways. This script is called extra layer controls. Essentially what it does is it uses keyword strings of your layer manager to turn, to hide, unhide, and select different objects. So if I'm working on a scene with another artist and they're working on set dressing the interior, but I'm working on lighting the exterior, I don't need anything on the inside. So I can quickly go and on anything here on the building interior, I can just hide all of those objects, right? If I'm maybe working sort of statically on just building exterior materials and I don't care about anything on the rest of the site, I can hide the site as well. So you see the site go away and you see those layers are frozen. And then, I can also, if I wanted to make a selection for isolation really quickly, I can use the selection function to select my building exterior. This will take a second because it is going to have to grab a bunch of different objects. So I can select all those at once and isolate that selection. So one of the big reasons that we're really strict about our layers and our naming structure is because we have these tools, and these tools allow us to operate in our scenes very quickly. So here we have the exterior model. And it also, layers by material, allows for a few other things, which is how we like to prepare our scenes for when we render. So let me unhide here the rest of my scene. So, one of the things that we do a lot is, if you guys look in the office, say, of the images on the wall, right? I can guarantee that none of those are direct render out of Max. A lot of those have different render elements that are layered over, which people will talk about in compositing, but we render a lot of mats too, so we can selectively control colors on different objects of different things, right? By layering things by material, you actually are able to select those objects and make mats very quickly using, so let's say for our, let's just pick a metal of the building here. So we have this particular metal. We use the object IDs of geometry tied into multi-mat elements in V-Ray to render out RGB mats for different objects. Again, for that particular function, we have a script that helps us with that. It's called the gbuffer ID script. This one was one we developed internally, but there's also a free one by Track on ScriptSpot if you guys want to find a free one online. So what this allows us to do is use our layer structure with the object IDs to render mats quickly. So let's say I wanted to make a mat of each, like say these first 3 metals. First of all, I can check my scene and make sure that there are no G-buffers applied. I can select that particular layer, assign a G-buffer ID of 1. So you'll see that all objects in that layer have 1, and then we can quickly go for metal 2, assign, metal 3, assign. If we check our scene, we now have assignments on 1, 2, 3. And then we also have a function that we wrote that create render elements from G-buffer IDs. So if we click this, come into our render elements, it automatically sets up a multi-mat for us. That sets up RGBs 1, 2, 3. So now if we render, we'll get our main pass, any elements, plus an RGB mat of the particular things that we want to use to paint further. So this is good for glass mats, all that kind of stuff. And then you can also use the different extra layer controls as well as the G-buffer IDs to make mats as well, right? So say you wanted to select all exterior metal, like you didn't actually care if they were separated. You could select all, assign that 4, and then your scene has 1, and then you can delete and recreate. So the strategy that we employed with layer by materials is much more than just an organizational tactic or scene sharing tactic. It's a way that we use the information to do everything from being in the model to finishing up rendering mats for Photoshop or for After Effects. Yes?
If you had to model everything from scratch, do you model the same way if it goes for a rendering than if it goes to a video, a complete video?
I think it depends. I think we tend to focus more on sort of 3 levels of modeling. One is high detail foreground, medium detail midground, and then context buildings background. And actually, the next scene I'll show, it's a really complicated scene. You'll see a little bit of that in play. So, foreground buildings like this, we tend to model a lot of detail. Or interiors, if you're 20 to 30 feet from an object, we tend to model everything and map nothing, right? So, I think our strategies tend to be more on how we see it and in between the 2 mediums, as far as stills or video. Rather than, still and video separating them out that way. It's much more about distance.
What about in terms of the workflow for like the rendering passes and so on? Do you use the same workflow for a video and compared to rendering? Yeah.
So I think I think our workflow for elements tends to be pretty consistent. I think we tend to render 5 V-Ray elements the most. Lighting, shadows, reflection, refraction, and occlusion. And after that, it's, and I guess I'd throw GI in there. So those are the main ones, and then mats. Because with those and a beauty pass, you can tend to do everything you need to do. But of course, there are special circumstances where you might want to do something a little different.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? No? And then, so if there aren't any other questions, I'll move on to the final scene, which is, I'll say that this is probably the most complicated scene that I've ever set up here at Neoscape, which is why I wanted to show it. It sort of folds everything that we've been talking about with layers into one piece, as well as we had to troubleshoot a lot of workflow issues and a lot of network rendering issues all in the same thing. So this particular project was an interactive interface for an iPad app. Essentially what it was is it's a project with 4 different phases that have 4 different, or they're 2 different sites, 2 different context sites, 4 different interior sites, and then 4 different phases of buildings. So a lot of assets, a lot of phasing, and what the application actually did was it was a turntable, or the frames were a turntable showing each one of these 4 phases. So you'd be able to spin around in each phase and click between the different phases, so our client could go to somebody who's going to be a prospective tenant, someone they want to sell a block or a building development to, be able to show them at all angles what this development's going to look like. So the beginning phase was something like this, where it was just 3 buildings and then this existing site. And then once they got to the second phase, there was actually a road alignment change. And then you can see the parking lots and things start to change as the build out starts to come up. And then once that's accomplished, it's actually going to be changing or adding different buildings in over time. So we needed to figure out a way that we could have multiple artists work on this at the same time across a bunch of different files. And we had to manage things like, how do you, once you switch the phase, how do you make sure that things that are on one phase and on the next don't change? So you want to make sure that, you know, the trees that are on in one phase and they don't actually change in the next have to be in the same position between the different phases. And then once we started rendering this, we ran into all kinds of network issues because we started using layers of XREFs, and we had to change our strategy then for the final product. So we'll come back here in a second. Once that opens. So a little bit about the workflow is we had essentially to establish lines, which were the surrounding roads first between the 2 different context plans, and then build up everything else around that and establish an interior perimeter for the site so that when every artist was working on this, they knew where their limits were and what elevations they had to meet for each particular part. We started off using all the buildings as XREFs and then all the different site phases as XREFs. And when we rendered, a lot of our plugins like Forest Pack and different things didn't render because they were not necessarily just because they were embedded in XREFs, but because of our particular workflow, it just wasn't working with our network rendering engine. So we had to change the strategy to actually make all the buildings live in the scene, which made the scene very heavy. The scene right now is about 1 gig with just the buildings, and then all the sites are actually referenced in. So it's a heavy file to deal with, but it was the only way that we could actually get it to render all the time. And you know, I know there's different functions in Max. You have the containers, you have XREFs, and then the actual like XREF objects. We're very careful about what we choose to XREF, and it's generally a last resort because even with network rendering, we find we tend to get more bad frames or like weird situations using XREFs, and we tend not to embed any plugins in XREFs. So like a Forest Pack or something inside an XREF tends to create more issues at network rendering time than something that's live in the scene. Again, everybody kind of has their own experiences, but that's one thing that we've learned over time, and we try to build our workflow around that. So apologize, the scene does take a little while to open. I guess, is there any questions in the interim while we're waiting for this to open about this? I think we have a question coming up in the back while we wait for this to open.
Yes. while we wait for this.
Yeah.
What I saw, yesterday we saw all these X reference inside X references. Today you're saying, you put everything into a single file. We
Yeah.
had the same experience as you had with
Yeah.
large files. And I was wondering, what is the, yesterday we saw that they were using Backburner for controlling the rendering farm.
Yeah.
Which software are you using?
So we actually use Deadline for network rendering. We found that I don't know if anyone's talked about the tech specs here, but we have about 45 to 50 nodes in our render farm, plus about 20 on the floor. And so we have about 70 total. And we found that while Backburner does work, we had to do a lot of management on the side of activating certain projects and certain sequences. Like, we had issues where we're rendering a lot of movies, and we actually exceeded the number of the sort of priority numbers of jobs that you can have in Backburner. So we had to assign multiple numbers, and then we had to have somebody sit and activate a job at priority of at a high priority, and essentially release job by job into the farm. So for Backburner is definitely a great tool, but I think for our size, it was really hard. There was a lot of management for us. So we moved to Deadline, and that you're able to assign a lot of things at the same priority, and it's managed by a central database, and it really takes all the things that we can throw at it and handles it a lot better. But it does still have some issues where we'll run into things like with XREFs or little things like that where it's either Max or Deadline. We never can quite figure out which one it is. We just need to work around the particular things, and we tend to find that putting things live in the scene tends to lead to a better result. And one of the great things you can actually do with Deadline is there's an option that you can merge XREFs when you submit the job. So essentially Deadline will take a scene with a lot of XREFs, put it all together, how it is in your scene, and then render it as if it's all compiled into one scene. So that's a strategy we've employed with things with a lot of XREFs to sort of mitigate that as well. But again, it's one of those things that it takes Deadline as long to do that as it would take you to do it. So you suffer on the submit end of doing that particular function.
Okay, and just another one more thing. I saw that you have a lot of course, V-Ray proxies and things like that on this image.
Yeah.
How do you keep your library? Do you have a consolidated library, or do you have a separate library for each project?
So maps and proxies are stored in our projects drive, we have a project folder, and then inside there's a 3D folder where we keep all scenes, all maps, and all proxies for each project. We actually don't keep a central library in the sense that we don't pull the same tree for every project and use it in the same way. We do have a central library that we pull in, but then we change those models based on each project.
Thank you.
Okay. We have another question.
While we're semi on the subject of Deadline, can you tell us what Deadline can do as far as speeding up single high-res rendered images? Not just animations, but single.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, let me see if I can. I can talk about it, and then I can actually show it. We don't have a Deadline up right now. So one of the things you can do with Deadline is Deadline kind of has so for Backburner, let's say, you can render strips, but if you're doing something with GI, you need to calculate your irradiance first, then send your strips. And this may have changed at the time I was using Deadline, the time I was using Backburner, you couldn't actually render elements in the strip mode, like render strips and render elements.
It does it now, but
Okay.
it's a pain in the butt.
Okay, so, and actually I apologize, this machine doesn't have Deadline on it.
You gotta make sure elements are out.
So what you can actually do with Deadline is it has a function called tiles, which is similar to strips, but it will render both your main pass and the elements and then stitch them together.
Do you still have to pre-calc?
You still have to pre-calc, your GI. So, I mean, that's more of a V-Ray thing.
Yeah.
and how that works. So you still have to but the great thing is you can send that to the farm as well. And with tiles, you can say 50 tiles and divide it up. Your image will be divided up into 20 squares vertically, 20 squares horizontally. So
you could exceed the 10 machine limit. You could exceed the 10 machine limit of V-Ray, for instance, by doing that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So and one of the other things you can do with Deadline is you can actually render distributed through Deadline as well. So it's called Force Workstation mode. It allows you to essentially open an instance of Max like you are distributing on your machine. And as long as you set up V-Ray correctly and set up your nodes correctly.
Do a DR in a radiance map then through Deadline.
Yes. And then you can set the priority as well for your tiles.
This is an image of the previous question from one of our viewers online.
Yeah. So again, I would check two things if I saw something like this image first. One thing I would check is make sure in Max that in your viewport, if you're viewing your scene with lighting and shadows, that you have default lights, 2 lights on, that could be one piece. Or in that particular image that you're showing me, I think we're it's in the browser in Chrome. I would check that default lights is turned on, number 1, and see if that fixes it. If not, if I see this, first thing I'm looking for is double geometry. And there are some scripts out there that help you sift through that. One is called Find Coincidences, which can help you find double geometry. But again, this is another reason why we do that 3DS, because this looks to me like it's a double geometry issue.
It looks like a back face code, I think. In object properties, you can turn it off and this will be solved.
Yeah, or the suggestion here was backface call in your object properties, so that might be another thing to check. But those would be the first and the last. So the default 2 lights would be one thing that you'd want to check, and backface call. And then I would start looking to see if things have double geometry by selecting the mesh and pulling it forward and seeing if there's something at that same plane behind it.
Not really a question, but another thing that might be is distance from 0. If the geometry is brought in very far from 0, it'll get jaggy like that. Yeah,
so that's definitely, I guess I don't know the technicalities of it, but my thoughts are that the database and the position information, like storing the long numbers, makes Max a little tired. So what we tend to do is I'll tend to put a piece of reference geometry in my base scene that I can, so either in say the Rhino or the SketchUp or the Revit file, like put in a square that's the size of your model, and always export that square out with whatever you're exporting, and then have that same size square in your file that you snap that geometry to it, right? So, and one of the techniques you can use for that is use your layers and use a group and hide all your layers except for your square that's really far away. And then you can just move the square, and Max forgets about all the things that's turned off. And so it won't be really, really slow, right? And then drag that over, snap it in, then turn on your layers. Your group's gonna pop up right where it should be, where all your other assets are, and you're off to the races. So I guess to answer your question, we always make a strategy to move it as close to 0, as we can, but then leave yourself sort of a coordination point so that, you know, the last minute model that you get from the client that you need to put the new windows in or the new doors in or whatever, you can take that object and just snap it into your new model quickly and easily.
Going back to your library, it's happened to us that over the years this library becomes very heavy to manage, and sometimes it's very difficult to browse the models, and our 3D artists like to do things fast. So I find that I found the same chair model like 20 times, and that's just because there are different folders, different files, different libraries that we've purchased. I wonder how you deal with this.
Yeah, so our library is managed by one person. So they're the gatekeeper in that sense of putting new models in the right places. And generally then what goes out is an email to the entire company about what that new model looks like and where it's at, or what those kind of updates are. And and I agree with you. I think we struggle with some of those same philosophies, that everybody sort of does their own things their own way in a lot of senses. Or people will spend 3 hours making a chair right, and then they're going to actually use that asset over and over again. So you'll find here at Neoscape that people have kind of their own little libraries for certain things, and then we have the big libraries which manage sort of all of the components, and the artist chooses which one to use based on the actual product that they're working on. One of the big things we struggle with here, I think, is sort of attrition in the curve of technology in the industry, in the sense that a model that we used and was good in, say, 2009, now for seeing up close doesn't look very good at all. So we've had to develop strategies of sort of dealing with those models and, I guess, phasing them out and then bringing the new ones in, right? And educating people to which ones they should be using over time. So I know for our library, we've done sort of these purges at a 2 to 3 year cycle, where we tend to start phasing things out and phasing things in. But that's sort of our internal strategy of dealing with it. So, any other questions? So, for this last scene, and I'll just go through this really quickly. As a more complicated scene, again, you can see that we're using that same strategy of layers. This scene does have a lot of layers because it's dealing with many different phases. And then we controlled the sites here through our scene XREFs. So I'll just show two pieces of this. One is, so right now we have phase 1, which is that empty site and those 3 context buildings. If we wanted to move on to phase 2 for this project, we just can't, we set up this for our extra layer controls. So we're going to unhide phase 2A. So you see the buildings come in here. We're going to disable our scene 1 XREF. And then we're going to enable our next XREF. And between that strategy, we're able to take a scene, a very heavy scene, and a very complicated product for our client, and make it relatively simple to manage and for many people to work on it, because things were layered in those phases. Somebody could take a phase 2 building, model the phase 2 building, make sure it works in the site. We could delete those buildings from our max file, import in the new thing, and then be able to render. So it allows multiple artists to be able to work in the same objects, merge them all into one big master file, and then we rendered all frames, all passes with the same light and the same camera from one file, with just, of course, the sort of lag time between loading the XREFs and unhiding the layers. So again, the site files are probably 200 megs a piece because they do have all the V-Ray proxies in them, and then the geometry for the context buildings. And that's what does take a lot of time here to be able to load those up between those different phases. But at least in this one, you can see how we'd set something like that up. And again, once this comes up, I'll answer the a gentleman had a question earlier about our levels of modeling, and I'll kind of show really quickly how we handle that differently in this particular scene, because essentially everything, the client for this project gave us almost all Revit files. So again, very heavy, very detailed. And we use those Revit files in the main scene. And then all our context buildings are essentially just massings with maps. But, and I guess the easiest way to show this here, if you look at the context buildings, again, some of the optical effects that we put on this won't let you kind of keep you from noticing it that much, but all of these buildings are simple extrusions with maps and a little bit of reflection on glass, and that's it. So everything around here is all basic modeling, and then everything in here is all detailed. And then actually, to give away a little secret, the only site that's actually geometry is the inside and the roads. Everything else for the site was a map, and then we hid all the things that made it look like a map with trees. So you wouldn't be able to tell that everything outside of the centerpiece is not actually modeled in 3D. So all of these things are just projection maps. So.
You mentioned you did a turntable of that?
Yeah.
How did you do that? I guess.
Yeah, so we just made sure in that sort of building process that, you know, we went through and we rendered 8 frames on that turntable for each turntable in each site, and then lined them all up in After Effects. And I mean, it was a pretty extensive like quality control thing to make sure everything worked correctly. But you just click through those 8 frames, make sure that at each point, turning them off and on, that it was looking correct, and then that way we knew it would actually work. But it was a bit of a gamble to start off that way, because we were trying to figure out a way, because modeling everything is kind of ridiculous, right? So we were trying to figure out a strategy that would allow us to actually be able to do that in an efficient way. So we have the phase 2 site here, and then again you can see these are SketchUp models, or you know, just simple extrusions with things on the roof, right, to make it look like it's a real model. So that's it for our production part. Are all I was planning on talking about. Are there any further questions about this or any of the other topics that we've talked about?
In our studio, when we work with the Rhino models from the architects, we have a lot of problems with the normal faces when we import the Rhino. So we solve it putting a shell modifier over the 3D model. Do you have another way to solve that problem?
Yeah, I think for glass surfaces like that, the shell, or
for walls, for example, or for a complex geometries.
Yeah. So I think that's the fastest and easiest way, right? Like it definitely is the way you solve that problem. There are scripts that will allow you to select objects and sort of normalize the normals overall, or be able to see really quickly which ones are flipped, and then just on button clicks go through and flip those normals. So there's that technique, but that technique takes a lot more time. And I would definitely say your strategy of shelling is probably the best technique. The only thing that you're going to do is you're going to increase your geometry by 6, right? Yeah. So depending on the complexity of the geometry, you may need to come up with an alternate method. So, but yeah, that sounds like the best way to go, even for walls, right? Because walls have thicknesses most of the time. So, any other questions?
Just one sec. To elaborate on that, we just imported a model with very complex geometries from Rhino, and there were lots of flipped normals all over the place. One thing you can do is in Rhino, weld all the vertices. Then when you bring it in, all the normals are going to be pointing at least in the same direction and not all over the place.
Yes, I was wondering. You show us this file, and when you were loading the all the surrounding area to a project, it took really long.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what happens when you send this to the rendering farm. You talk about the 50 rendering nodes, and how do you deal with that? When the 50 nodes are trying to access the same information, I mean, does it get clogged somewhere?
Yeah. So that's kind of a multi-branched question in the sense that deals a lot with deadline. This goes back for us to a little bit of a deadline and a back burner question, and sort of how your IT infrastructure works, which I'll give you the brief rundown, but I definitely am not the expert on how our IT infrastructure, but deadline will allow you to, it does a lot better job of really complex scenes, really large files, a lot of assets, and being able to manage how those go out to different machines at different times. It will stagger sending a job, like it won't send a job to 50 machines at the same time, because that's going to create a tremendous pull in the back end.
Yeah, Backburner will do that.
Yeah. Well, so that was, for us, another strategy that we did. So, or another selling point of deadline is you can throttle that a little bit, and you can set sort of the number of machines that are going to pull a job initially, right? So it'll essentially offset those things. So you have a group of 5 machines that pull. They start queuing up and rendering. The next machines pull. The next machines pull, right? So it's managing all that stuff for you. So you don't have a render wrangler or some guy sitting at the computer sort of releasing or controlling which machines are rendering which thing at which time. So that for us is managed a lot by deadline now. So.
Hi. Just looking at this scene, what type of trees are you using? Is it forest pack or just multi-scatter?
Yeah, so if we go back to the images here, so we initially started with forest pack for the context site. And again, in that idea of we were having trouble with forest pack embedded in XREFs through deadline, with it dropping the forest packs at certain frames. One of the things you can do with the power of forest pack is actually lay out your forest, and then you can convert it to proxies. So essentially you use forest pack as like
just
scatter mechanism, right? And then embed your proxies. So in the XREF scenes of the site, all the objects are proxies. Some of them use forest pack to establish their position, but they're actually all proxies in the site file.
Inside the scene.
Yeah. On the buildings where we have a lot of detail and these sort of green roofs and these like parks and different things that the client was very interested in showing, this like very active, vibrant rooftops. Those are all actually forest packs in the master 3D scenes that sit with the buildings. So we were able to do forest pack in the main scene, just not in any XREFs.
Okay. What about because one of the problem we have in our studio is if we send to the farm some missing maps, especially if it's a very big scene, how do you put the maps on a single folder on each project?
Yeah, so each project has a maps folder, and then all maps and all each project in the 3D folder for that project contains all max scenes, all maps, all proxies for that project. And they should never, we're very strict about, they should never be linked to another project, because if you're altering, for proxies it's less important because generally you're not altering geometry. But if you're altering a material, it can create problems about someone for another project is going to render something and their wood's going to be orange and not brown, right?
So it's not taking the maps from the model library. It's on the folder on that particular project.
Exactly. Essentially, we run a library for maps and proxies for each project, right? We don't have a central thing that we use for all projects. in the sense of rendering with it.
Is it stored also on the server or on a workstation for
everything?
for the
Everything's
artist?
on the server,
On the
and
server.
everything's mapped to the server. And we generally always use UNC file pathing.
Okay.
So, and that's something that once you set it, once you set that in max, it'll carry through. So you want to do this convert file paths to UNC. You want to make sure everything in your file from start to finish is in UNC, because if you use map network drives, you can't DR. You have to use, or here at least, we can't DR. So we need to use the UNC, which is the hard code for the server, and then the actual volume share. So everything is UNC, and we're very strict about if you open a file and there's a missing map, it's your job to fix it, right? We don't want anything coming up with a missing map or a missing proxy, because that's the first indication that it could cause a problem down the line.
There's two questions. There's one back there, but there's also one online. Somebody wanted clarification as if you actually render each building as a separate pass with the same lighting and camera.
For the scene that's up right now? Yeah, so this scene, when it renders out, it looks pretty much like this. There is a little bit of post and a little bit of effects work, but we didn't actually render out the site wasn't different from the main file. It was all rendered in the different phases all together.
Okay, I always think about how to do the reflections of exterior, because interior is easy.
Yeah.
The reflection, you see the windows, you see the room, but and here you've modeled the whole environment, so you got the reflections done.
Yeah.
But when you don't have any time or money to do that, do you photograph the environment and like place back plates for real reflection, or how do you fix this?
Yeah. So, I think that there's a bunch of different strategies, and it really depends on your scene, right? Something like this, like you've said, we actually didn't need to do much work on this, because essentially it's just reflecting the ground. We had the ground, it was good to go. For aerials, that can be much simpler in the sense that reflections on aerials you can be really cheap with, or sorry, I shouldn't say cheap. You can do fairly easily by getting a Google map, mapping it to the ground, and you're pretty much set, right? Any shot where you're on the ground looking up, really all you need to worry about is what's adjacent and then sky, right? And for sky, we have a library of hemispherical maps, which will plug into maybe a dome light set to just reflection, or plug into the override and pump up the output on it so that we're getting the right sky reflection. And then, the adjacent building really comes down to what you have time to and your access or your accessibility. So, we work on projects that are kind of all over the place. So it sometimes is difficult for us to actually get out to a site to take a backplate appropriately, but we might be able to go on Google Earth and to Google Warehouse and download 3D massing of that building with texture maps, and drop that in, play with the GI contribution or the reflectivity ability of that building and those maps to give us the effect that we're looking for in the glass. If it's local, yeah, we definitely go out and we'll shoot backplate photography for refractions, or we'll sit down and shoot a quick sort of 180 pano, or some sort of thing that we can put on a plate, make it self-illuminated, or do some strategy like that to get the reflections in for a particular project.
Yeah. Do you use any HDRs as well, or?
Yeah, certainly, and I think lighting is one of the later modules today.
Yeah.
And I think they're going to cover some of the techniques we use for lighting, but certainly for I think night shots or some reflections in day shots, people will use images or HDRIs to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
is there an online question? I'm done.
Perfect. Okay, well, let's wrap for lunch now. All right, we're going to start up the afternoon here. We've got Dan and Johnny. They're going to be talking about, totally lost my place here, the lighting.
Right.
So I'll pass it over to you guys, and we'll switch out in a couple minutes.
All right. I'm Dan. Johnny. And us with Nika Nikitina make up Team Flannel at Neoscape. I know you didn't wear it today, so you're off the team, is what that means. So yeah, we're going to talk about lighting. I'm sure everyone's favorite subject. And it's not so much going to be the intimate details of all of the technical side of lighting. Unless you want it to be. We'll answer those questions too.
I'll do a couple of those.
He'll do a couple of those. What we want to start at least with is a lot of foundation, how we approach a project, how we plan it and research it, and then ultimately implement it into the scene. Everyone has gone through the same process. There are a million ways for people to do this. Everyone has their own comfortability with their own process, but this is how we've achieved what we think are really nice, well-lit images that that sell the project the way it needs to be. It's an artistic output we like, it's an output that the client likes, and everyone wins. So from that, we'll start talking about, and from all the cameras in here, I can't imagine anyone knows what this is, but the photographic process. So this is essentially how we tackle what we want to do. It can be such a daunting task when you're approaching a scene strictly 3D. You have so many options, so many different ways to light, so many solutions for coming up with really intricate lighting ways. And so what we do as a team, and what a couple other teams do here as well, is pare it down, think of yourself as a photographer. How is this going to work? We can make this work in 3D if it can work in the real world with what a photographer would actually use. So we go super cheesy and cliche image. That's a camera. That's our scene. Got to treat it at least as close to the same as possible. And you'll start to find a roadmap of a good way to start, I'd say 90% of your images, unless you have a really specific scene that calls for a complex solution. So this is, for those of you who don't really have an extensive background in photography, this is a chart of your exposures and the three parts of an exposure on three parts of the camera that deal with your exposure: your aperture, your f-stops, your shutter speed, and your ISO. What's brilliant about what we do, obviously, is while all those work in tandem, we have none of the restrictions of a real photograph. We don't care about the noise when we bump up the ISO. We don't care about the shutter speed so much unless we're doing an animation. We don't care about the aperture unless we're strictly putting depth of field into our image. So if we approach each of these images through the V-Ray camera with realistic exposure settings and having them work in tandem, then we'll be set, at least from a baseline, to then worry about everything else we're putting into our scene, our materials, the lights, etc. So if we keep the camera at a realistic constant without the downfalls of what an actual camera and film and digital work with, then we get a more repeatable result. This is what everyone learns their first year of photography school. This is a zone system, Ansel Adams. These are your black points all the way through, so pure black, pure white. And then so with a photograph, and just like with rendering, if you can stick between 2 and 8, you're probably doing pretty good. When you're done with your render, you want it to be as raw as possible, just like a raw photo. If you're not shooting JPEG, you're shooting raw. You retain a ton of color information. Your whites aren't clipped. Your shadows aren't crushed. You have a perfect starting point to bring it into post, no matter what you use, After Effects, Photoshop. Bring it in, change those values, get exactly what you need in each part of the image without blowing something out or really crushing the blacks, which can be a real problem. And this is just an example, just a recent shoot that we needed to do, get the Boston skyline. So this is just straight from the camera, the DNG, or if you're shooting Canon, the RAW. So that's exposed and white balance for the scene, knowing that we wanted to have as much clarity as possible. And then just a simple, really simple bridge raw adjustment. So much of that information can be pushed and pulled and finessed into exactly what you want. But if you start with something like this, you're not going to get it. And again, for those who do a lot of photography, you already understand that. But that's a really important note, is to make sure, as seductive as it is to have a render output that looks exactly how you want it, it's always a little bit more of a best practice to have it neutral, to know that when you're looking at it, it might seem a little dull, but that means you have all the color information that you need, more or less, to work through it in post. And a sidebar to that, I think, is also really important. What we try to do is get familiar with architectural photography. So I've brought this up with my team, and when we start projects, we typically do references, either well-known architectural photographers or per space, a good photograph, a well-lit, well-composed, well-set dressed photograph of a similar space that we're trying to do. So we've gone through smaller exercises, but I think it's always really important to know a bit of architectural history. This is a fairly important image, Ezra Stoller, JFK Airport, like to really understand when there was a bare minimum to how architectural photography started out, how they set up their scene, how they used so much natural components to light that they didn't need to overdo it. And you get these really compelling, beautiful images that, because of the play of light and shadow, bring out the form of the architecture, bring out the space. It ends up being really iconic, and not only just because of who they are, being the Julius Shulman, the grandfathers of architectural photography, but it just in and of itself is a beautiful image. And moving into more contemporary people, Iwan Baan, great work. To have an image like this in 3D that everything's so starkly white, but can be so balanced. That's an ultimate goal I think we all have struggled with and know very well. But in the real world, it's achievable. So in 3D, it's definitely achievable. You have to be able to see your scene and know what you're going to pull out of it to get the right image. So I wanted to, if any of this stuff is interesting to anybody, some really good go-to photographers, Iwan Baan, Houghton and Crow do really good work. Chuck Choi. And the classics I just talked about, Ezra Stoller and Julius Shulman. Julius Shulman has a film that I'm sure a lot of you have seen. It's on Netflix, Visual Acoustics. And Ezra Stoller, they just published a book with his work in it. Just amazing, amazing stuff. So I would definitely, and it gives you perspective. It gives you a starting point to say, this is how somebody else that does this every single day would have approached this in real life. How much closer can we replicate that? It pairs back all of the multitude of options you have in 3D, so you don't go overboard and just fill your scene with lights because you just need to light it and get it lit, and that's it. And Iwan Baan's fantastic as an inspiration for how to include people in your scenes as well, because that's what he's really known for, is giving space a life that a lot of photographers don't do. He always makes sure that there are people in his scenes that really make it look active and believably active, not so composed. So those are good assets to have just in your back pocket. All right. Yeah. So another important thing to think about when you're approaching these images is getting familiar with a few things. Design intent. I know everyone that is in this field has varied backgrounds. Photographers have come into it not knowing much about architecture. Architects have come into it not knowing much about 3D or photography. Strictly 3D artists have come into it not knowing about either. So this is kind of another portion of being well-rounded about this approach. Design intent, if you don't know so much about architectural principles, design principles, it's good to at least study a little bit. Get a familiarity with it. You'll have a better dialogue with the architect. If in fact the architect is your client, you'll be able to derive what you're lighting and why. You'll be able to know that this vertical space that has a skylight needs to have that nice natural light come down to it, and then the rest can fall back because it's not as important. You'll know certain aspects of the project that get to be more intimate, and it'll inform your lighting through that. However, I know a lot of the work we do here, I don't know about everyone else, is marketing driven, so the developer or non-architect. And it's also as important, even if it's not as so much of an artistic approach, to know their intent, how they're selling their space, how to light the space based on what they're selling, how to get that point across. And the third is obviously a pragmatic approach to the space. So literally, what are the spaces? How are they going to be used? Who's going to be using them? Is it important to show this smaller room in the very back of the image, or is it not? Know the project you're working on. This is a phrase coined in 2013 by Dan Ferraro. A 3D artist is a photographer with unlimited resources. It means you can do whatever you want, but still act in accordance with what a photographer would do. You have the ability to say, oh, I want a 60-foot by 60-foot softbox that sits over this space that would cost $420,000 in real life, but I get to do it for free. But it's using that same technique that a photographer would use. It's not going overboard and just throwing as many V-Ray lights and V-Ray sources as you can just to get the intended results. It's a more pure approach to lighting a scene. Asterisk here because I feel like this is the most important part of how we approach lighting the scene. So we think of all the things we just talked about, and then we think about the scene, and without any other light, okay, environment light. What's the purpose of this image? Is it day? Is it dusk? Do we know that we want sun coming in? Is it better if this is a north-facing wall that's just going to have ambient light? All those are good. It all depends on the project. Ambient light seems to be more fun. So always start with the environment light. We all like to start with the grayscale images, the clay rendering, get that HDRI or your V-Ray sun, your V-Ray sun and sky, however you like to do your environment, but start your exposure with the environment light and work your way in. Everything outside of your scene will inform everything you do within. So if you start with that, if you start with that approach and get a nice balanced environment light, it'll be so much easier. You have such a solid base to start saying, okay, now I know we'll have a row of 8-foot linear lights. We'll start doing that. That's our first round of artificial. I know we'll have this many pendant lights. This wall is going to be washed with wall washers. This is going to be any number of specific lighting approaches you can then do in step 2 of the hierarchy with artificial. If at that point you get to your scene, you say, okay, it's nice, it looks believable, what's the next step? Architectural photographers would then supplement with either large bounces, reflectors, or off-camera lighting. So you find in your composition, what needs to be highlighted per the project needs, per the design, and set up the same way in your scene. You put a V-Ray light or an IES or something that will highlight a specific portion of the image that may not have been brought out with just what was spec'd for lighting or what was in the design. Or you can literally set up a large white card X amount of feet off of your natural light and bounce it into another section of the room just like you would do in real life. And you'll start to get some really nice results. Again, beating the horse, really repeatable results. And so when something comes into the process that might have originally thrown a wrench into what you're doing, you'll have something to fall back on to say, okay, I'll just undo this and try something else. It's not going to be like, oh, I need to redo this entire thing because went overboard. So with that as the foundation to how we plan it, I'll use an example of a project that we did this year that turned out fairly well in our eyes and in the client's eyes, which is good. So we are asked to, if any architects are in the room, you'll know who Hayworth is. They do a huge amount of architectural or office interior furniture. And we were asked to do renderings of a new product for them. And they went the way that we're all familiar with IKEA going, and they said, okay, we're tired of paying photographers and set designers and builders and electricians to do this. We'll test and see if going 3D is the way to go. So they hired us to do, this is an IKEA image, of 3D image of theirs. They hired us to do this, basically. Highlight their product in 3D, make it photoreal for their catalogs. And we said, oh man, let's do this. And so, yeah, we went on a scavenger hunt. The next step of the process was getting our references, just like we were talking about with getting architectural photography references. Now we wanted references per this type of space. They wanted, I'll give you a backstory. They wanted, there were immovable walls. So they're nice, minimal, sleek partitions that were easily movable. They weren't destructive to the space so much. And so they wanted to highlight the walls and what they did to different types of office spaces. So our task, one of the office spaces was something like this, like an industrial, warehousey type of space. How can we partition it and make it look interesting? So we started to find inspiration for how we could approach this, because it's a little bit different than the IKEA way or even their original product in their catalog. So it was a kind of a mix of both. We needed to be catalog worthy at least, and interesting different types of spaces than they typically have done. So we found some decent inspiration that on many fronts worked, on materials, on composition, but specifically for lighting. How are these spaces affecting the light? Are collaborative spaces typically in well-lit areas, or are they secluded, or how they handle their office and their private spaces, things like that, because it was an open book, which can be dangerous. But it was an open book for us, and we needed to have precedent imagery that guided us through and informed our decision making. So we found a pretty great selection of images that we always had open. Is this material reflecting the right way? Is this light really coming across the wall the way it should be from the exterior windows? Like, it was a really a good back and forth between real life images and what we were producing. So from there, we started to render. We had our space picked out. We took literally this space. We had a few models. We put it together. We rearranged it. We took all the furniture. This is one of the images. We did a few images per space. So this would be considered kind of a mid-range. It's not really a wide shot. It's not a detail, but it gets you, somewhere in the middle of intimacy with the type of work that they're doing. So you get pretty close to their product and a little bit of the detail of the product and how it can be used in the space. So with this, we're thinking, okay, you can assume that there are either private offices or meeting spaces on the right near the exterior wall, and then cubes, the typical open office layout to the left, which you do see in the other images as well, but you still get that sense from this image. So we're thinking, all right, step one, what will the exterior light do? And we can literally walk over there and say, okay, we shut off all these lights. This is the effect that the lighting has on this space. It will be usable about a third of the way in before you need artificial lights to really bring out the detail of the rest of the space. So the first shot that we did to test the lighting worked in that regard. We said, okay, a small amount of sun shadows, you get a nice soft shadow from the exterior windows and a bit of a harder shadow from the first row of partitions, and then that bounce can fill up the rest of the space to an extent. And then we start doing our first round of artificial. We get the linear lights in there. They're just shooting up. They bounce a little bit more of that 4,000, 4,200 color temperature light around the space. So you get that orange and blue starting to work together that you would normally get. And then from there, we get our more detailed artificial, so the pendants, spotlights, etc. So now we're at a point where we like the balance on strictly white, on the clay rendering. And we start to introduce materials, which is a long drawn out process because the clay render isn't always as true as soon as you incorporate, say that floor turns into slate or something, an ebony wood, then you're throwing off how that light is bouncing in real life. It's not coming off as strong. It's not filling up the space as well as it would if it were a white painted floor. So you start to get this. This was our raw render. And through many iterations, we were happy with it because if you see underneath that credenza there, you still see the color information in the shadows. It's a big deal. Because if you bring that in Photoshop, now you have the bandwidth to work with that color and you're not crushing it right away as soon as you put a curves or a levels on. Same thing with the sunlight that's coming in the offices and the conference room. It's even, but it's there. So when you're rendering out your 32-bit EXR, that color information is there just like a raw image, and you can play with it, get it to the tone that you like.
Color mapping really helps.
Color mapping is also huge. Reinhard, if you're not using it a lot, it's really good for interiors because that hard bounce light is going to want to blow out really easily. So if you put on your Reinhard color mapping, bring it down to 0.5, 0.4, 0.3, you'll start to see it even out, and you'll still retain the shadow and highlight information. And then it came to this, and so now we have an image that we ended up liking for ourselves, liking for the client, and has resulted in more work with them, more work with others, because it's a believable product and office shot that we owe a lot to the lighting and materials, but definitely a lot to the lighting for this procedure.
That was a fun one.
That was really fun. All right.
Okay.
You want to do it?
Switch it up?
Switch it up.
All right, cool. You go under.
Yes.
All right. What's going on, guys? I'm gonna run you through two scenes that we did, an interior and exterior. So one of them will be Hayworth. Oh, did you want to go over a PSD here?
We don't have to, unless anyone wants to. We have the PSD open with all the layers, but
Why don't you run through it?
we could. Yeah, so this is generally how we go about. So this is just the raw coming in. Or the base in general, because we had a couple edits that had to go on top of it that were comped on just the base. And then we start to bring in the adjustment layer. So the adjustment layer goes through the wire color, any multi-mats that you have, obviously, reflection passes, all your render channels, and that's where we tend to keep all of those. I don't know, I know you guys went through a full day of AMD. I'm sure they had some pretty complex PSD setups, but this is generally a good workflow for us to really handpick exactly what we need to from the wire color and edit as we see fit.
Yeah, wire color's awesome. Super important for getting exact lighting and stuff.
The glass layer was a big deal, really emphasizing that these are glass partitions. It's not always the fact that it comes straight out of V-Ray with a believable glass texture. So throwing in different overlays, screens, and whatnot of the reflection pass and a slight green tint helped bring the glass up to a believable level. And then the composition layer, the comp layer brought in other elements such as the writing on the whiteboard, an outlet down here, things like that that weren't originally in the file. And this is the final overlay of quick color correction at the end.
Okay. All right, so now I'm going to go over a few ones right here. Let's see, production lighting. All right, so I'll start with Hayworth. This is another interior we did. Yeah, I'll open this one up as well. So I'll just go over my little process and then maybe a few technical things that we did with these. So, okay, all right. I'll show you the final here first. So this was the final image for their Fortune, it was the Fortune 100 section. We did 3 renders of this area. We wanted to get, a really cool image, kind of the middle distance like Dan did with that warehouse where it's not, a detail but not a wide shot either. We don't often get to do those, so right. We were really happy about getting some details in there. So while it's loading up here, okay, cool. All right, so I'll go through the clay process as well. So starting with the wrong image, we're going to, all right, here we go. So starting with the environment. We wanted to separate this out because this is there are 4 offices here, and this is the only one that doesn't have, it's kind of a cube, the only one that doesn't have access to natural lights. It's not touching an actual window. So we knew we could separate those out. As you can see, we get the blown out background here, but then the nicely balanced over here and plenty of details. So we use very, very slight AO. I think it's like a 0.2 in V-Ray's actual GI settings. And then once we get that right, and we've got the DOF and everything here, then we will start adding other lights, really subtle. We add right here I added the lights for the exterior. And let's see if it shows a difference there. No, okay. So then we'll add the interior lights right here. And one of the things that's really important for lighting on interiors is, I see some people like to use, like one big V-Ray square, but that doesn't give you, the nice multi-shadow, like right around here from that you would get from multiple IES lights.
Yeah, the contact shadows are really important.
Yeah, yeah. And even though they're crisp, because there's multiple ones, it kind of softens it out. It's a nice effect. And another thing that we like to do is actually turn these ones on in 3D with a V-Ray sphere light that only affects the light itself. So we've got an exclusion going on here. This scene's a little heavy. Might take a second here. All right. So we've got our actual light here, and then our V-Ray light. So it only affects our light fixtures, and we turn that one on. It's not the best example here, but on the other images that were from this set, it worked pretty well. I'm just going to close all those. So then for the last one, we'll do the supplemental lighting, which was just right here to get a nice focal point. And then onto the final image. And this one, since we wanted to take it as far as we could, we even went as far as to put things like carpet depressions right here under the chair, where they would normally be. There's right there. And those were just done in Photoshop, but it's the little details in lighting that sell the whole thing. And then the lens effects as well. So let's see. For that one, we used a V-Ray Sun and Sky.
There's a question, Johnny.
Yeah.
Hi. Sorry, that scene was very interesting. If you can go back to the interior scene. Because what I find is that if you're coming from the 3D world, you always try to mimic as much as possible what happens in reality and how the light bounces back and if it is daylight or if it's artificial light. If you're coming from architectural photography, however, I find that most architectural photographers I've met, they're trying to go to the opposite level. They're trying to, for example, if this was a shot taken by an architectural photographer, he would have replaced the halogen light with a daylight, and he would try to minimize the yellow from the artificial light, and he would try to eliminate as many shadows. And also, for example, just like you, we also love this kind of overexposed light coming from the windows. But like I've met different architectural photographers where they try to minimize it and work with the HDRIs and so on. Your studio is doing renderings and also photography. So what's your take and like to what state or how do you approach this? Like
the difference between trying to fake it like a photographer and
or because it's always try to like the photographer tries to make it not as realistic but closer to the image that he has in his mind, and it's and he tries to bring that artistry into the photography. And on the other hand, the 3D artist tries to make it artistic, but as realistic as real as possible. Even those little details, the on level on the carpets and so on. Those are the details that give the I don't know that realistic flair, right? So
yeah. Well, I mean, this one in particular, we needed to make these, catalog worthy. So these had to be, the little nuances, the realism had to be there. But there's certainly a lot of images where we go for more of a surreal, moody look. Like we do a lot of softy work, and he wants, an ethereal look to things. So it doesn't have to look exactly real, but pretty close.
I think that comes back to what I was saying about being a photographer with unlimited resources. Because as an architectural photographer, you're right. You try to use whatever you have in your tool set to minimize imperfections. And as a 3D artist, we get hung up on those imperfections, and we love, Mudbox and ZBrush and putting in those little details. I'm sure we've all seen on forums when people are like, look at all this chromatic aberration I just put on, isn't that great? And we're like, no. Every photographer in the world hates chromatic aberration. It's a fault of the lens, like you don't want that. And so I think once you get past what each specific industry's tools give you, then it comes down to your personal preference. Because there are architectural photographers that don't want to see the exterior behind a blown out glass wall. Sometimes there are. Sometimes there are architectural photographers that do like that warm and cold color balance. Sometimes they like to keep it pretty stark white, no matter what their light sources are. So I think once you get past the limitations of both, then it comes down to personal preference. And so I think we wanted to, with these images, get enough detail that it passes as a photo without an overly grungy photo, without like stains on the leather or something, that you would like try to make it feel like it was used. It was trying to find a balance between those two, I think.
Yeah, we did go into some of the details they would probably get rid of for this one though. Like I put a few small coffee stains or coffee rings around there. They're hard to see though. Yeah. That was just for my personal fun, I guess.
Yeah. But sometimes it's those imperfections, if they're not overdone, it makes everything that's fake sit better.
Like the swiping right here of, when they're cleaning the chrome. So you just get a little bit on the reflection glossiness there. And right down here, scratches.
It is.
What's up?
He asked if that was my coffee mug.
Oh, yeah, it is. This is actually Dan's coffee mug. So that was the interior for this one. We will go ahead and move on to exterior. So this next one was for Buffalo Speedway, and I love to do dusky exteriors. Wait. Okay, Forest Peck. Stop complaining, Forest Peck. All right. So this was a fun one. Here, I'll show you the final. So this is for, was this Texas, right?
Yeah, this is in Houston.
Houston, Texas. A new building they're doing over there. And they had, I think they got like $5 million off for their bid because they decided to keep the trees. And they really wanted to accent these old oak trees. So we wanted to do a cool atmosphere, moody type render. And we went through a few phases. So I'll just go through the lighting on this one. what we did was, as always, we start with the environment, if that's going to be the main source of light, which outside I would hope so. So I started with Guthrie's 1941 Dusk Blue. I love this one. I think it's probably my favorite HDRI. I love his HDRIs. But so here we go with just the HDRI here and a different sky. This was the final sky that we landed on. I just threw it in there because it's better than just on black. And so it's a little, it's a little muddy right there. You can't really tell a differentiation between the trees and the building yet. So I decided I wanted something a little bit more direct. So I added just a small supplemental light. It's just a direct back there. I think it's at like 0.02 intensity, something crazy low, to get the nice highlighting on the tree leaves. And that actually pops a lot more when it's not a clay render because you get the V-Ray two-sided. So, and then we move on, and I put the lights in the building here. I'm going to open this up and show you how these ones were done, because they're not actually lights. It's just a light material. So I'll go into the, where are you, ceiling? So I'm going to here. And what I do is, usually I'll have a few blend materials. And where's my slate? There we go. Yeah, okay. Oh.
What?
Fiddlesticks.
That's new.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
All right. So basically what it is, though, is it's a blend material and, a multi-matte material, and I select, a floor, and I'll change it to a different material ID, and then I'll have a single UVW map on it, which kind of fits all those together. And I'll try and get in there one more time to show you guys.
Question?
Question? Yeah? Sure.
Just a quick question about the lighting layout. Was that based on the design of the building? I see it's different on most of the floors.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, not so much that they had spec'd that these floors are going to have this type of lighting.
Yeah, they didn't.
But we did know that this portion was going to be, general office space as opposed to something else. So.
All those floors?
Yes.
So
but it just seemed very varied from floor to floor, which
right.
catches the eye.
We wanted to do that, knowing that the glass is really reflective.
Mm-hmm.
So in post, you'll see that we selectively, you see it more of like a selective showing of some of these lights. So it's not the same type of light every time you see through the reflectivity.
And it wasn't going to be, one company in there, and so
Right.
we figured they could customize their spaces, and that's just one of the
Show the variation.
Yeah, kind of show the people who might want to buy into there that they could customize if they wanted. So, all right, we got those lights turned on. See how they look. As you can see in this one, we changed it so that it was less reflective or less refractive in the final, in comparison to right here. We wanted it to be like halfway so that we could either make it more or less, just because post is our favorite part. Let's see. All right. So next, lit up the ground floor. They have a little Starbucks down there, which is hard to see from right here, but you see it in other shots. And then we go to the exterior of the building, get these nice fins lit up. And so each time we turn these on, we're going through and just checking for balances, which is why we turn them on like one at a time. Make sure it looks correct, and then move on, or else it can be hard to tweak, multiple lights at the same time, see what's affecting what. Then we go through and turn on the garage, and they have some uplighting over here to get some ivy. And then we have the lights up front. We wanted to get some nice catch on the grass there, which I think turned out pretty cool in the final. And then the tree lights. And so one of the things I did for this one was make use of the V-Ray Light Select. It's one of my favorite elements. So I have a V-Ray Light Select for the trees themselves, so we can go through and mess with that later. Also did that for the downlights in Hayworth. And then the next part was the atmosphere. So this is the V-Ray fog pass that we just did in a separate file. I wanted to do a fog pass here instead of a Z-depth because I wanted to get the all the lights basically instead of just actual fog. And I wanted to make sure that it faded out as it went up. So this is actually a really simple setup. It's pretty much default. I just checked on use or bounce GI. I could set it up right now. It's so simple. Where are you at? Environment. V-Ray environment fog. So I just did the fog distance something far, so like 500, 600. And then fog height, like 40 feet. Scatter bounces, 100. Make sure all lights are on. Super simple setup. Just do it in your own file, and then you can save out the V-Ray atmosphere element, which holds the alpha in it. It's really nice. Okay, so now that we have this open, I'll show you the light material for the ceilings. Oh, don't you do it. Don't you do it. Don't do it. All right. It's pretty simple stuff. I just used the gradient ramp and did square ones, and then I kind of stretched the tile for Lin lights, and that's it. And then the last part on this one was choosing the sky. I do like how this actual first proof of concept image looks over the final, but you got to go with what the client needs. So they didn't like the car there, I guess. So we went through. We had this sky initially, but they didn't feel that it popped from the sky enough. Kind of blended in. And then we go through the process of changing the trees. Not much changed here at all. And then we went to. This was the pre-final, so we started to change up the sky here. Dan and I went and we changed the right side of it and painted a little bit more inviting over there, and then just punched it more at the end.
Really separate the reflecting building from the backplate.
Yeah,
so it stood out more.
Yeah, you just want a strong silhouette.
Right.
And that was it. That was the final right there. You get the nice mist around here from that atmosphere. And then we painted a little bit back there to kind of get, the rain from the wheels of the cars. And that was that.
Questions?
Yeah, any questions?
Questions?
Yeah? Oh.
You were talking about the V-Ray, the light select element.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, could you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So the V-Ray light select element, I believe it came out with 2.0, or maybe a little bit later. Anyway, it came out in the last 2 years or so. And you just add the lights that you want to it, and it will give you only those lights as the light element. So here, I can run through it real quick. It's super simple to use. It'll load up in just a second. It apparently just does that and then loads up anyway. There we go. So, oh man, none of my keybinds. This is going to be weird. All right, so we've got our lights here. So we'll do boom, 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 boom. And then we go through our elements. Add V-Ray light select. And remember to change the output file if you're doing more than one, or else it'll just write over itself and you won't get the next ones. But you basically go through here, and I found the best way to do it is to just isolate the lights you want, and then go add, hit H for the pick by object name, pick it, and there you go. So it's basically the same thing as the lighting element, but it's just the lights you choose. Super helpful.
Do you use that on all projects, many projects, or ones that you anticipate having to change lights a lot?
Not all projects. It's just, if I feel like I'm going to want to change that light after, I'll do it, which ends up being most projects, I suppose. Want a little
especially if they're
flexibility.
larger projects with a lot more spaces that you might need to finesse later on. That's a big help.
Yeah.
Compared to not setting up the render, is there a lot of overhead as far as rendering time that
No,
those
not
elements?
at all.
Cool.
Yeah, it's a freebie. Behind you.
Do you have to save out in a 32-bit format for this to be useful?
No. We usually save with 16-bit EXRs. Works
So
fine.
8's not going to work, but it does have to be.
It would work, but I wouldn't recommend it.
Okay, all right.
It's not going to get you like a
But
great
16's,
accuracy.
16's good enough to cover this.
Yeah.
All right.
Mm-hmm. Any more? Oh, there we go.
A question about the trees. You talked about the significance and the value of the trees. So they're obviously 3D trees. How much attention did you have to spend
Actually,
to the, making them true to reality? Yeah.
I will show you what the close-up of the tree was. This is my pride and joy on the project.
It was a big selling point of the project. Those are going to be there in that plot for 1,000 years, they estimate, the type of oak that it is. So it was a big selling point to that development. So we wanted to make sure, especially for this picture you're about to see, that we represented it as closely as possible. So we built in a little bit of time into our workflow to make sure we could model and edit trees.
So I had a little fun with this tree. It's got displacement and moss and things like that on it. I'll show them I guess I'll show you the proof of concept. I think I had like butterflies and stuff like that in there.
Tell them how many times you had to mow the lawn.
I had to mow the lawn, yeah. Every review, they said mow the lawn.
That was our comment.
Mow the lawn. I mow it a little bit.
Mow the lawn.
I get a little bit of mow.
We don't know what this 3D stuff is. Mow the lawn.
So, where are we? Yeah, see, you see crazier. The earlier we go. I got pigeons. We got a squirrel in the tree. This was a fun one.
They appreciated the effort.
They did. They did. So yeah, a good bit of time. I spent a day on this render to get it to that POC level where you see right here, and then a day to get that other one that we just. Where are you? I know you're around. Oh man, did I close that? Projects, CG School. And then I spent a day to get it to this POC level here. So these are different trees than that one up there, but they're pretty close.
So two questions online here.
Yeah?
Can you explain again the artificial light from the spotlight and the shadow? Do you use IES files?
Sorry, what was that?
It says here, can you explain again the artificial light from the spotlight and the shadows, and do you use IES files?
Yeah, we use IES a lot. If you find a good IES profile for the type of light you're using, it's really beneficial. It just adds an extra layer of realism to what that light would actually do in real life. You have good contact shadows on the surfaces that are surrounding that light. It just is more reliable than putting just a strict V-Ray plane into geometry, we think.
Okay. And there is one last question about, I wanted to explain more about the V-Ray fog pass and how you did it.
Okay, I can open that one up if you'd like. I have it right over here. So the atmosphere pass, basically what I did was I made everything a V-Ray matte object through the V-Ray matte properties. Actually, I don't know if I did that one or if I just made them a black light material. But either way, it doesn't matter if you're just using the atmosphere render element, because you're going to get the alpha of the atmosphere no matter if your objects are affecting it or not. So simple pass here. Atmosphere. Sorry, it's like a 200 meg file. Takes a minute to open. So one of the things that I really dig about the V-Ray atmosphere pass, or V-Ray fog pass versus the just using a Z-depth and painting with it, is that you get the color bleed from the lights. So you get the warm light here. And I didn't use super high settings, so you get like the graininess there, but I feel like it kind of adds in this instance to the fog in the air or the wetness of the air. So what we have here is I have only the lights on that I want to affect it. So I have the environment and the tree lights and then these lights right here. And the garage, but it didn't go so far back there. So I have the fog color at like a medium gray, which I think is about default, and then the fog distance is pretty far. The further you push that, the less dense it's going to be. GI bounces 4, this is responsible for it being kind of grainy. A lot of people could push that to 100 or even 1,000 without too much of a difference in render time. I'm not sure why, because it just sounds crazy to me. Right. Fog height 40, so that's another big advantage over the Z-depth, is that it'll cut the fog height, so it's just more realistic, much more realistic. Step size is pretty important. For images where you have a large fog distance, you could probably make this much bigger, because it's just going to calculate it within a 1-inch volume for me. And that, let's see, I upped the max steps to get more subdivisions in it, basically. And just use all lights. That's really it. Everything else is pretty much default. Let's see, we have, let's see what material I used. Whoa. Okay, so I used a material wrapper here. Don't crash me.
Every time.
All right, I used a material wrapper though, and it's basically the same thing as setting things as a matte object through the V-Ray properties, where you right-click it and tell it not to affect the alpha. But you can just do that globally with the material wrapper. Yeah. And that's did that answer the question about it? Oh, it was one of the online ones. Okay.
Yeah, all the onlines are covered now. Yeah.
Cool.
You're good. So I think we're gonna do a quick. Yeah.
The PSD? Oh, for the one I was just showing? Okay. It's a pretty big one. I think it's 1.8 gigs, so yeah, 1.9. I like my 16-bit. Anybody got any Jeopardy music to play?
A question about your output size while this is opening. AMD was doing 4,000 pixel, pretty much standard. What do you guys have a?
That's us. Yeah.
It's about the same.
Yeah, we do. We usually try to do 12 megapixels, Seth. Yeah.
Between 12 and 16.
Yeah, that's usually what we sell as. So depending on the aspect ratio, but it's almost always 4K. Nice round number. Right. All right, back in business. So I was not planning on presenting this, so it's kind of a mess, but I will I will run you through it. So here we go with the okay. What do we have here? All right, so here's the base render. We went through and did the sky back here. There's a few different skies just kind of plastered on top of each other. We had a little fun with it. And then so we go through, add some adjustments. So right here we have a bunch of different elements. I am an abuser of elements. I will tell you this. I use a lot of them. So I've got my total lighting raw as a soft light, and all these ones over top of it are just from a region render. Our reflection layer, I like to paint in some reflection there. Lights, punch it up a bit. Specular, which you cannot tell is working. And the light select element on the garage is very subtle back here, but we could put it higher. So that's another instance where the light select comes in handy. And then GI, which also helped for there. And that was just fixing a little issue. I had something going through there. So here's more the tree lighting to kind of push the atmosphere on top of them. Building interior. I used the GI pass here because what I did here with the light material, because the way that's done, it's put into the GI pass, the light that it creates. So you can just kind of paint the lighting into it. And then we want, let's see, look at the building accent here. So they wanted it really reflective. We just kind of took the sky, plastered it over. And then, oh, we took the car out. So we just placed some people in here. Make sure they're color corrected and such. And then we added some paint. So we painted this exterior over here and added the fog back there. Overlay the atmosphere, which is just the atmosphere pass with the little curves on it to kind of punch it a bit more. Add another curves. Actually, that one was on. And then this is one of my favorite passes right here. It's a little trick I learned a while ago. So I take this one. Oh, I guess I didn't totally do it on this one, but I basically just take the original render here and then color balance it really, really harshly. So I've got a lot of warmth in there, and then I just paint it in. So I painted in the warmth on these lights down here. And then punched it a little bit in areas over here, just to get the nice warmth, warm hot spots. A little balancing, little vignette, and we're done. That's it for that PSD.
Yes, one question. So basically, you took the image from the modeling until you finished it in Photoshop, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and is there anybody in your office who takes care of all the images, so they are consistent?
No, we powwow after we do a set. So like Dan and I and Nika will take all three of our images that we split out from a single project and look at them together and make sure that they work with each other. Another thing we do, or when Carlos and I used to work together, he's over there, a lot more frequently, is we look at them all in Bridge and do those final consistency corrections in Bridge itself so that we can see everything together.
Thank you.
On glass buildings, even though sometimes it feels that it's very straightforward to do, I find that the most complicated elements to render properly is the glass.
Yeah.
And I didn't really understand the importance and the complexity of glass until I came to North America, and I found out how the reflection and the refraction of the glass varies depending on the argon gas that it has, and it's beautiful. Like when we take photos, we find that that double reflection of the double side of the glass, it really adds a lot of depth to the buildings. And that is something that we're always trying to see how we can render it on our renderings. We've tried different methodologies on coming from 3D, but they are very time consuming, coming from Photoshop. I wonder if you ever had that same kind of questions, or if you have ever tried to do that, and if you have, then what has been your workflow?
Well, normally on a glass building like this where it's far away, we don't use double reflection, just because the differentiation between the two reflections would be so small, you couldn't see it. But the way to get the double reflections is just in the glass material under the options. You could say reflect on backside, and that will give you both sides of the glass reflecting. And that really helps in combination with a refraction and reflection elements, or if you want to do also the raw refraction, raw reflection, then you can work with it more in post and really get it exactly how you want. And then another way is to do what we did here and just literally slap on your sky onto it and play with it in Photoshop, you know, the old school way. So those are the methods we usually use. Yeah. Do we have any more questions? No? Yeah.
Materials?
Yes. Okay.
Can I close this without saving?
Yeah.
We're gonna. All right. Let's see here. You were having a problem with Slate in 2014, right? Yeah. Okay. So, for our material piece today, we're going to do 4 sort of separate but quick little things on materials. I'm going to focus on 2 things that are more about how to use modeling and max in conjunction with materials in order to get materials that have some variation. I know there was a question after the production section today about, I think in the vein of importing things, but the question was if we prefer to have models made or model things ourselves. I think especially when it comes to doing materials or making sure materials are done in an architectural way that we do them, we definitely prefer to do a little bit more of the modeling in-house if we can, because you can model in texture with the end product in mind rather than trying to figure out a solution afterwards. So one of the better examples of this in my mind is using real-world scale to properly map along things like splines. So I wanted to do a quick show of that here today and how we use that in production. So as you can see, I have a fancy curb, which is just, you know, a spline, the fillet, and then the sweep here. And again, your profile can vary based on what your actual shape would be, but I wanted to give it some shape so you could see how this actually works. So We'll come in. First thing we're going to do really quickly here is drop in a tiles map. Tiles maps also can hold real-world scale information. So essentially, if you're not familiar with real-world scale, you're just going to be, instead of driving your material on your object with a UV map on top, you're driving it with the material size and shape in the material itself. And then you can either add a real-world scale modifier on top, or most of the built-in geometry for Max already has mapping coordinates built in, and then so you just need to activate it. For something like curbs, the standard is an 8-foot curb, so you can say something like 40 for the width, and then a height of 8. Again, you can affect the height based on the topology of your scene and how much you actually need to make that high. So I'm making a really wide panel that's going to have some variations inside of it of different materials. So I want to make my horizontal count 5, so I'll have 5 separations and 1 vertical. And then we'll just make our gaps really thin and apply this to our object. Actually, I'm going to take this back a little bit. And then you just need to make sure, generating map coordinates, real world scale. Let's make sure this is turned on. So now you can see that in our scene, we're actually getting proper mapping along the spline based on our real world scale map. So we can come back here really quick, maybe thin that down a little bit. The next thing you can actually do too, the bitmap, is we have sort of generic concrete material. And one thing you want to do when you're working with the real world scale is you want to make sure that your proportions of the dimensions that you put on the map reflect a little bit what your map actually is. Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of stretching. So this map is 3 by 2, 3200 by 2400. So in this particular case, I'm going to make it 8 foot wide and 6 foot tall. So that'll maintain pretty much the proportions of my map. And then once I show this, I'll be getting that map stretched essentially inside of the tiles map that we're showing one level farther up. So it's a really quick way to be able to get a texture. And then with the tiles map in that real world scale scenario, you can begin to add color and value variance. Unfortunately, because it's a gray map, it doesn't have a lot of color variance, but we could crank up something like the fade variance for the value and start to get, I guess I cranked that up a little too high. Maybe let's do something more around 2 to get something here that, with a spline, with a simple tiles map and a diffuse map, we've already started generating a curb, something that would look architectural in one of our scenes. So very quick way to use real world scale. Another good thing about real world scale is that you can apply it, again, like I was showing with those layers. And if you have an instanced real world scale map, you always know that all of your objects, because when you select a layer, they all have the same instance map. You'll see the instance map pop up in your modifier panel, and you know that everything in that layer is mapped correctly, and you know that the size is all correct because you have it based in the material and not in the actual modifier. So it's another way, sort of quality control check, to make sure that you're not getting random scales on things like you would with different UV maps in a scene. So the second part that I'll show is another sort of 2-step process, which is for a lot of our interiors, we end up modeling things like floors, right? Because we want to make sure, while you can do detail in a tiles map and start getting, the different grooves and reflections and things, having geometry gives it sort of that extra level that you can actually get more detail into. One things that we use very often is, again, a free script online called Floor Generator. The interface is the interface doesn't necessarily respect units, so you have to do a little bit of conversion in your mind, as far as it doesn't really accept feet. It just works in units. So if you're going to do something 8 foot long, you have to type in 96 because 8 times 12. So I'm going to do a floor of 8 foot panels, 6 foot wide. And then the other, you can certainly explore and figure out what works best. But the other big, or the other pieces that are the most important are gap length. And then I do all the extrudes and bevelings myself with edit polys and shells. And then this row offset. And then making sure that all of these things are selected because they're going to drive the mapping of the objects in this that the floor generator creates. So right now we've essentially, you have to draw a spline, and then you select the spline and you create a floor. So now we have a floor. You can come in, you can alter some parameters if you want to make things a running bond, slight different offsets. But one of the things I'm going to do today is, sometimes you don't get standardized flooring from different clients. It's going to have a particular pattern, particular layout. And let's say you can use the power of the geometry to define that floor pattern, but then you can also use a map that's not that same map as the driver for those materials and put in some variation. So I'm going to apply a floor material here. So this map is a high-res Arrowway texture map. Bunch of different floor patterns, but as you can see, I did a 20% offset, and it doesn't match my map. But I can still use pieces of this map in my floor generator and have some variation. I do apologize for the little 8-bit images here. This is just to help you guys when I'm going to start laying this out to see how it's actually flipping the different panels across the map. So what we'll do here first is we're going to apply a crop to this image, and I've selected this red panel first here. So if we take that crop, we apply this material. I think I'm applying to my spline. So we apply this material. You can see now that that particular panel is mapped onto each individual object, and because we've selected these different random UV offsets, you're actually controlling, they're actually flipped and varied in a bunch of different ways. So the next step then is to take this particular thing and figure out how we can actually drive more, right? So how we can take that particular map and add maybe 4 or 5 different variations of the texture or the color. So to do this, I'm actually going to pop into Slate and show how I set this up with some linked hierarchies under Slate. So I can eventually then add additional maps later on. So one of the things I want to take out of my texture here is I want to instance all my cropping placements. So I'm going to pull out all of these into Bezier floats really quick. So they'll store that information. And then one thing I always do, I always set my blur as close as I can get to 0. So that's another one that I always pull out. So I'll pull out those 5 for now. And let's say we actually wanted to put a bump map into this as well. Again, in Slate, you can just shift and drag, and it'll instance all of those controllers. So our crop and our diffuse and our crop and our will be bump map will all be the same. So we can then just link in our bump. So you'll see that our bump is in the same location. And then we can just drive that up here into your main map. So now once we have this set up, we need to look at an approach on how we can actually set up some material variation. So to do that, I'm going to copy this material, and I'm going to put it into a multi-sub material. And we'll open up this multi-sub. I'm going to set the number to 2 right now. and we're going to, so this multi-sub gives us 2 different materials, and then what I need to add to make this work on the Mac side is I need to add a modifier called material by element. And there's 2 different ways to use this. One is a random variation based on a number distribution. The other one is to actually figure out how you want those materials distributed across the geometry. So I will take this now and apply it. There won't be any change to this scene at the moment because my second material is still the same material. So let's show that map. And what I can do then is come into this material, and I can zoom in here on one of my other little 8-bit color graphics. And you'll see that now, once that crop is updated, and again, because we copied that, the secondary crop of the bump is also brought to the bump map because we've linked those parameters. We now have different variation. And so now if we wanted to list frequency, I did a light and a dark. So we could say that we want significantly less dark materials. We can tone that down. And then correspondingly, you need to manage adding the other one up. I guess I've never checked if this automatically defaults to 100 at some point. I always make sure I do the math so there's no leftover pieces. And then quickly, just with what we've shown, again, dragging our whole layer stack, pulling down, and I grabbed a little too much there. Let's deselect him. And we could take and make 4 more. And just drag this down, zoom in. Delete the 2 that came in automatically. Link these in. Again, just move our crop down. So we get a lighter one here. And we get another one here. So an easy way to use a pre-existing map, and then we just need to and then all we need to do is once we have that material set up with 4, we need to, come back up here, random distribution of 4. So you can take a piece of geometry, have a few different maps, and then start applying a bunch of variety. And then inside of that too, you can start adding all your typical normal maps in between, your diffuse, or sorry, your bitmap and your diffuse channel, so you can do color correction nodes, different things like that to even take one image and actually add a bunch of variety to it based on your geometry and your multi-map element. So that's pretty much it for that. Is there any questions on either of those 2 pieces? OK, so now I'll just hand it off to Johnny. Johnny's going to be doing a few other ways that we do some variety of textures, specifically with V-Ray. So, Johnny?
I'm Johnny. Nice to meet you. All right, so let's see. Full speed width. All right, so I'm going to show you one of the methods I use to have errors when I open. Oh, it's 12? Yeah. OK. There we go. All right, so a while ago, I ran into the problem of, well, not really the problem, but I got fed up with drawing, huge road texture maps to get like the road lines and oil stains and all that stuff. You end up doing like an 8K map, and it's just ridiculous. And so I decided to use a new method. I don't know if any of you guys have used the V-Ray distance texture. It came out a year or two ago. And I essentially started using that to draw texture maps in 3D, or masks for blend materials. So I'll go ahead and open up this guy. Yes. Okay. So what we have here is just a bunch of splines and the road. So for this particular project, we needed to do a few things on the road. We needed to do oil stains, and this was a large development. It's for New Balance's new site. We needed to do oil stains, the middle yellow lanes, the double lines. We needed to do a bike lane, and then which would be green, and then we needed to do the white lines as well. And in the intersections, we were going to need a lot of oil stains and things like that. So instead of doing one big map with a bunch of masks, I went through and did a... Dude. I think I'm just going to open it in... I won't open it in Slate. Because what's happening is that left bar tries to load forest textures, and it just crashes it. So I think if we do it in compact, it'll work fine, yeah. While that opens, I'll show you what the renders are, what the process went through. So this is geometry right there. That's not part of it. But so here we have the standard road, and so the first thing we needed to add were the oil stains. So we went through and did that by adding a spline here, and you could just draw it. And one of the greatest things about this is you don't have to do the guesswork in Photoshop. So here is our oil stains. I just drew it there through the line right here. So you just draw your lines as a top down. And here we have the oil stains for an intersection. Throw a sweep on it. That lets it go up through the street, up through the road right there. And it will catch compact road material. Okay, so it will go through, and in this one I chose to use the V-Ray distance texture over in a composite material instead of doing it as a blend material. Although later on you'll see that I did use blend for other colors. So I have, I believe it's this one. Yeah, here is the normal road streak texture right in there. So here is a road. And then we have the V-Ray distance texture, which is, it's just saying, like 2.5 feet from this object, plus the inside, which will be solid, make this darker. So here's the darker. It's 0.8 gamma over that section. And it just kind of fades out, and I usually use a noise right there in the distance texture radius, just to give it a little noise, because oil isn't so linear. And you just tell it what to affect. So we've got the road lines oil right there. And that gives us this distance, or this difference. And then we wanted to add, what's the next part here. Go up, up. Wanted to add the yellow lines. So this is just your standard yellow line material right there. Nothing special about it. And right here is the V-Ray distance texture. So for this one, we wanted it really sharp. So like the smallest amount you can have right there for the distance plus inside solid. But I will give a little disclaimer. The inside solid, at least in 2012, was giving a lot of issues where when you pull away from it, you'll see that it gives like streaks along the ground. So if you have any of those issues, that's probably the culprit. I'm not sure if they fixed it in 2014 or later versions. But if that is the issue, what I've done in the past has been to up that to something like 0.5 inches and then put that thing like 0.01 inches from the ground, like the top of it, so it's almost touching it, so it looks solid the whole time. And then what I did was used a Comptex here to give this nice, the nice cracks along it right here. So I just multiplied noise and the scratch map over the V-Ray distance texture. So it gives that the cracks in the bump mask or in the mask. Now I had three or four other ones on here, but they were kind of linked in the slate, which is, as you can see, giving us a little trouble. So I can't really open those, but they were set up the exact same way. They're actually using the same distance texture and not distance texture, but everything else. And the only difference really is the object that it's pointing to. So we went through here, and we just drew those lines right there to give us the yellow. And then we need the bike lane. So we add the green for the bike lane, and you can see the nice effect from the cracks and the noise kind of fading those cracks out as well. And then the white lines along those. And I can't tell you how helpful this has been, this technique for doing this on large sites. It's been a changer for me. So that one's been really helpful. Do we have any questions on how to do this one?
Why are the objects invisible in the rendering? Are they set as matte material?
They are not renderable. So object properties, everything else is turned off, but they are renderable. You can actually have this checked off too, and it will still work. Just make sure it's not visible and that it doesn't affect GI either. So you go to the V-Ray properties from the right-click menu, make it invisible to all that stuff. Any more questions about this one? Okay. All right. Another thing I wanted to show you was the use of the V-Ray multi-subtext. This one is pretty cool. So V-Ray multi-subtext is a no. Oh. Raouf!
Save it as 2012.
Yeah. Okay.
That should work, right? You can back save it.
Yeah. Where is? All right, there's 2012. I'll open that at the same time. Yeah. All right, down save. All right, is everybody crossing their fingers? Yes. All right, we're back in business. I could show you that that other material real quick too then. So we have, here is the full material for the road, Fury blend. Boom, boom. Just like that. So we've got the different blends, each one with their own respective distance texture, but they're all being pumped through the same compositing to get that, the cracks. And then you have just simple diffuse materials for the road, or the details. And this one, okay, so I have about 8 different cars right over here. So I've got 8 different cars over here. They're all V-Ray proxy objects. And when we render them as they are, let me just make sure that they're all one. We render them as they are. They all have the same paint color. So they're all just black. And we use the V-Ray multi-subtext to kind of get around this. So what I do is I have this basic car paint, and then the flake color and the diffuse color is dependent upon this V-Ray multi-subtext. So what you can go through here is put 20 different colors or maps and assign them to material IDs right here or gbuffer ID. So you get to choose which one you do here. And I have it for the gbuffer ID, object ID, same difference. So I just went through and took a bunch of different colors from cars that I knew were, somewhat common, and added the gbuffer IDs to them. So we have all the default color right now, but then I'll run through, grab all these cars, and then run this lightweight script right here called the gbuffer ID something or other. So then I'll randomize it between 80 and 99, and I like to use the higher numbers for this because I usually use lower numbers for the multi-mat elements. So then I'll just hit randomize, and what happens is we get a whole bunch of different color cars. So it's only 8 different cars that we have there, but from a distance it looks like it could be a lot more different cars. And it's also the Burning Man of vehicles. So this is useful for many other things than cars themselves. We use this for, this could even be used to kind of simplify what you were doing before with the different texture maps. So you could use a single material but change the texture maps through the V-Ray multi-subtext. It works good for tiles. What else have I used this on? This one, it just has a lot of different cool uses. So that one, that's pretty much it for that guy. Does anyone have any questions about how to use it? No? Okay. Do we have any questions online? I can't really see from here. Is Jeff over there?
Are there online questions? Or?
Yeah, we can't see it right here.
So the question is, can I control the material ID by map?
By map? What does he mean? Control the material ID by map? You mean control the actual object's material ID with a map?
Wait for a reply here.
Oh,
like a luminosity, like a lumimat?
Lumimat. I don't think I still don't understand exactly what he's asking, but let's see. So we have the face material ID there. Does he mean randomize the maps within here or control something's material ID through a map?
I'm wondering if he's saying if there was a map underneath all the cars.
Yeah.
With grayscales, right?
Yeah, like a grayscale. Like
each grayscale, we change the. I think that what they're asking is if they had a map with grayscales, right? And
yeah.
And he could use the grayscale to.
I'm sure you.
As an intensity or as a red would be the black would be like the red cars and.
You would only have 2 or 3 options though.
Yeah,
with that,
there
right?
weren't that there couldn't be that many options if that was the case.
That would have to be done through scripting, I believe, to check the bitmap's color and then assign the material ID to the object.
I mean, it's sort of how force pack works. In
Yeah.
a broad sense, but I don't know how you pipe that into. If that is indeed the question, how you pipe that into the things, the geometry.
Yeah, that would.
That could be a cool effect. You could in effect make a matrix of cars like a video screen or something.
Yes, like with a projection map or something on top of it, or yeah. I mean, that would be an interesting thing to research on how it could actually be done.
Yeah.
Cool. Any more questions about this topic, or should we move on to the next?
So he's clarified that question. He said the question was for the floor generator.
Oh.
Sorry.
So, what is the question was whether or not you could control. Sorry, let me open this up here. It's not precious, right?
No, no.
I guess in some ways you probably could. I guess the clarification I'd go for is the question is if you have geometry like this here and you have, I didn't save my scene, so I need to. I think I have a material in here. That's the end material. So the question is, can you use a map to provide variation? The different variation instead of the multi-map. I think you should be able to do that. One of the reasons we showed it in this particular way is that the method in using the modifier stack is we sort of broke our materials into max specific and then V-Ray specific. Using the modifier allows greater flexibility across different rendering engines, but you could use floor generator, and then you could use, I'm guessing you could use you could probably link in a tiles map and use that to bring in different randomizations as well. I mean, the options are definitely limitless in some respects in what you can do. I've never done it that way because I've always used the material by element to do it. So if the question is using a map to provide variation, that's something that you'd have to look a little bit more into. But certainly with this technique, you can use different maps as well. You could unplug if you're looking for just more variation than this actual diffuse map, you're certainly not limited to just one map like I used. You could plug in 5 different maps in your diffuse slot with cropping patterns in order to get different colors of wood or something like that in the floor. So you're definitely not limited to one diffuse map. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
Oh, there they are.
Yeah, nothing's coming up.
Any other questions?
Orange, are you next?
Okay.
Just doing a quick mic switch here, so just bear with us a minute.
So we've gone through, hold on. So we've gone through a bunch of different things from the beginning, and starting from, the beginning of the project, the creative treatments, the storyboarding, some 3D workflows, how we prep our models for stills or animations. It ultimately doesn't matter. It's pretty much the same in general as and it changes. Just little things change depending on the project size and all that. So it's time to come back to the films themselves, and so basically we've gone through everything that gets us to a point where it's time to make an animation, right? So I want to talk very briefly about the camera animation. And the first thing, just as we take our cues from real life, like Dan and Johnny talk about lighting, composition, cameras, exposure, and all those things, and as much as possible to have a grounding point to start. We also like to do our camera moves as much as possible at the beginning as real camera moves, meaning I want to do pans, dollies, crane shots, simple moves, simple, elegant moves that are justified and that help tell the story. As not to say that we don't make any crazy cameras if the project requires them, right? For example, we can do let me open a file so that at least people online can take a look at something and not just listen to what I'm saying. Sorry about that, guys. Save the files in the wrong spot. So going back to the natural camera moves, and the sequence that things need to, the way we like to do this is, if you take a close look at most of our animations in our website or anywhere, or many films for that matter, a nice, easy way to put an edit together for people to digest it without it being jarring is cameras move from left to right and from bottom to top the whole time. So it's either the camera is doing this and then up and then pushes in and then up and then pushes in. It can push back and stuff like that, but it's always moving right because it's positive. Moving left would be something negative, and it's like simple little things that old tricks, old school, things that you used to do in films is, when something, the camera is like a Dutch angle and, something bad is about to happen, just that visual reference. You want to avoid all the negative moves if you need to avoid them, right? So we start like that, and I just wanted to show you one animation and one simple file, one simple max file that gets the point across as to how we actually start doing cameras for a project and how we show it. So let me show you first an animation that we like a lot, that we think is a very good example of, and Vasily will talk about editing with Rodrigo after this. So I won't elaborate too much on it, and Vasily and Rodrigo can explain further the editorial of that particular film. So let's start with this 3D model, right? So as you can tell, I went to architecture school. That's an awesome building. So it's just obviously, you know, a representation of something in there and a bunch of cameras in there. I want to show you two things that we do here for cameras, and it's all about personal taste, really, and how you want to animate your cameras. We have a little plugin or script that creates this camera with these 3 dummies, right? So the dummies control the camera. So you can animate them, right? So if I go to this camera, you can see that I have a very simple move just looking up. And if we go to the curve editor, you're going to find that you can't see it. It's in the other screen, right? Doesn't seem to be opening. Well, something's going on with this, but the advantage of doing the dummies versus doing the camera, just the camera, animating the camera, I have this camera here that's doing the exact same move as this camera right here. This camera, the camera is animated and the target is animated, right? So if that's the final camera, then you're solid, right? You're golden, you need to change it. But if you need to change that camera, you have so many curves that are animated into it for both the target and the camera that you're gonna have the hardest time tweaking that camera, right? If you're not, you know, it's just gonna be a nightmare. Way too many curves. It's gonna be, you know, there's a chance that it's gonna be, it's gonna have bumps in it. It's gonna move faster and then slow. So it's gonna be a nightmare. With the dummy, the exact same move only uses 2 curves, 1 for each dummy. And then the other advantage, if we could see the curve editor, is that when you move a camera, when you animate a camera like this, just the camera and the target, the values are way too high. They're like 3,000, 4,000 when from one point to the other. When you do the dummy, you're gonna find it like 100, 300, 200. So your curves are not like insanely big or anything like that. So that's really the only difference. I personally do the cameras the hard way. So it's the most of the cameras you see here is the way I would do it. But there's many artists in here at Neoscape that like using this rig, right? So that's one thing. We have the script that creates it, and it's a very simple script. We can share it with you guys if you're interested in trying it out. So going back to the cameras. So this is more or less how we name. We literally just name camera shot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the way I create them is I basically, for this building, in telling the story of our goal is going to be only to show this building, right? To highlight this building. We don't care what it is. So instead of doing a big fly around or like a turntable or something like that, we're gonna break it into maybe 6 little cameras. Make it a little bit more interesting, right? Something that can be edited to a piece of music. So literally I create this as my first camera, and it's just a linear move, right? We start at the bottom, we're moving from left to right on that camera. Let's assume that I like that. You can see I have, I use my safe frames as a rule of third, kind of breaking it in there. And I try all the time to do, maybe a third of ground, 2/3 of sky, or the opposite. So a very simple move this way, we're moving from left to right. Then I would copy this camera, basically just select the camera, clone it. It's already going to have an incremental number to it. So you start, I do it linearly like that. And I would go to camera 3. Camera 3 would start going up and keep going up, showing the project and keep moving to the right. You want to keep all these cameras linear. You don't want them to ease in and out. You want to make sure that your moves are always constant and always smooth. And then doesn't need to be like that, but that's how we start, right? And that's how our editor Vasily likes it, right? And he'll elaborate on that. We keep going up, we keep turning to the right. Then we go to camera 4, same thing, I clone it, move it up, delete the keyframes, and I continue. Maybe this is the detail of the top of the building. Continue doing the exact same thing. Clone it again. And then we're at the base of the building, and we come down. This camera, the last camera, does have an ease at the end, because you want to be able to come to a stop, come to a rest, and be able to eat. Sometimes we do that, and we hold on the last frame. The client obviously wants to see the building at the end for as long as possible, so you can just literally hold on the last frame, render 10 more seconds of cars and people, and then you're done, right? That's the end of the animation. So that basically what we did there in a very simple way. We created a fly through, right, or fly around this building without it being boring, and it was completely positive the whole time. It was positive going from bottom to top, around and down, but not literally, right? The last camera, although it was from top to bottom, it was just pointing up and then coming down. Very simple moves, nothing fancy. And that gives a lot of material to the editor to start working, with in a cool edit. Of course, all these rules are meant to be broken, right? And when do you start changing direction? Because you want to change direction at some point. Not all the thing needs to be positive, like I'm just saying right now. Right now, I was just focusing on showing this building. We only showed it from every single possible angle without it just being a 360 around it. Let's say that on that podium at the bottom, there were to be like a garden, a swimming pool, stuff like that. You already showed the building, then you go into it, you go into the garden, you change the direction, you push, you pull back. Or if it's the beginning of the film, you start pushing in. If it's the end of the film, you end pulling back. If you're going into the building, let's assume that after I went up all the way to the top of the building, when we were rotating around at the very top of the building, we're going to go into the penthouse, and you can change that immediately to maybe a push, a pull, whatever you want it to be. So that's kind of the rationale that we use for the animation. So that being said, and before I show you a couple of examples of what we think is a finished product that shows what I'm talking about right now. Is you guys need to get this book. It's called In the Blink of an Eye by Walter Murch. It has some nice reviews from people you may know, like Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas. So, a very short book, a very good read, and it's one of those things that, I assume most of you started doing this the way everyone else did, like myself, just doing cameras because I thought they were cool looking cameras, and that's the end of it. But after I read this book, it was clear to me why the cameras we were doing worked. And instead of like, oh, well, that works, right? The theory is here, and it's a very short read. It's a very cool. So it's on Amazon if you want to buy it. It's like $15. So let's just take a look at that film, and I'll show you the 3 stages of it. I'll show you the animatic, the rough cut, and the fine cut of the film. So let's see. Let's take a look at the animatic. I'm I'm not gonna try to play it full screen because it's not gonna play properly. So very quickly we'll go to the rough cut. You'll see there's going to be a few changes in particular because this was for staff the architect and residential building in Colombo, Sri Lanka. So you know they were really focused on the design and there were a few things that they wanted to highlight a little bit more. But for all intents and purposes, it's pretty close to the end product.
in doing these cameras that it applies to everything in the process is the camera that's before and the camera that's after, the preceding shot and the shot that's to come. So again, not that you can't have, if you have a shot going right and then immediately you have another one going left, you better have a good excuse for it, because it's not going to work. So that's one thing to keep in mind. I'll show you just the final one, so we don't run over time, but you get the point. So that is, thank you.
Do you have any preference on camera lenses, and if there are different camera lenses that you use, do you have different types of movement depending on the lens?
I usually try to stick in between the 24 and the 50 millimeter lens for like the medium shots. There's also, when we're far away, we go to 100, 150. Try to keep it in between. We try to keep it in the range of the lenses we have for real back in the storage room, right? We have a 24 to 105. We have a 70 millimeter field shift lens. When we are in like a room like there's one interior in this film, right? And there's really just that one unit that we had to come up with because it wasn't supposed to be about the unit at all. It's obviously like a 17 millimeter lens or like a 19 millimeter lens. It's not a huge unit, so we had to adapt to it, right? But we like to keep it, like this one most likely is kind of like a 50 millimeter lens, camera pretty close to it. There's no rule we follow, but at least when we do cameras for this type of film, we start in that range, and then we keep adjusting depending we want to keep the drama or not. Like those top-down shots are pretty scary looking, right? The ones looking up are super cool looking because they're wide lenses, and plus the drilling is huge and it has a cool shape. So it's part of the storytelling, you know. So it's a personal choice, I guess. Have another question?
Yeah, I have a question. So earlier today we got some recommendations on architectural photographer, right? And thank you for the book recommendation. But I wonder if there's any movie director or any cinematographer, any movies, any things that provide inspiration that we could look at to get to understand.
You know what? I'll leave these guys talk about that. They went to film school, not me. But you know, there's to me, I don't know a lot of film theory, right? Personally, but if you take a look at old films, like from the 70s back, that's what you're trying to base your storytelling, you know, on, not the Michael Bay films. There's nothing wrong with that, or Cloverfield, you know, like shaking everything. That's fine. It's part of the storytelling on their films, right? Just recently I watched Pacific Rim with my kids. It's pretty intense. All the camera and then you know all the things that are moving and exploding and the VFX and all stuff, but. At the risk of sounding like a geek, which I am for Star Wars, there's nothing more boring than what Lucas did in 1977 for the original Star Wars, right? But he used it properly, right? It's like iris dissolves and wipes and super simple camera moves and nothing too fancy because they really couldn't, right? Those were the constraints, but they didn't need it to do any of that because the storytelling was good. And that's the point. This animation is a very simple animation. It's supposed to be an architectural film about the building, about the architecture, but just because we had the one car driving in and the guy getting in his apartment and looking out the balcony and like, this is such an amazing unit, and that's it. It changes the thing completely, and then you don't require the fancy moves other than to introduce the building. If you notice, the only change in between the animatic and the final was we're not seeing enough of the building, okay? Let's introduce the building as the first character of the film, and that's when you're like showing all these crazy views, right? And then you tell the more personal, intimate story, and then you end with both of them, you know, from the distance. So it's I would recommend going back to any, you know, like any old film and dissecting it, you know. Again, just recently, just watched with my kids Ghostbusters. You know, even films like that are not like, oh my God, the award-winning, you know, photography. No, but you have to analyze them for what they are. You know, think about when you see a new shot. What was the shot previous, and what was the shot or the shot that's coming next? And that book is going to give you the insight into that stuff. But I'll shut up and I'll let these guys teach you the real deal about filmmaking. Thanks.
Okay, we're just going to do a quick mic change here, and we'll be back in 2.